This is Chapter 34 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 34, The World's Highest Pig Farm. We hired the only guide left to lead us on our way. He was over 70, but he could have given me 9/10 of his strength and still had all his age entitled him to. He shouldered our satchels, overcoats, and alpenstocks, and we set out up the steep path. It was hot work. The old man soon begged us to hand over our coats and waistcoats to him to carry too, and we did it. One could not refuse so little a thing to a poor old man like that. He should have had them if he had been 150. When we began that ascent, we could see a microscopic chalet perched away up against heaven on what seemed to be the highest mountain near us. It was on our right, across the narrow head of the valley, but when we got up abreast it, on its own level, mountains were towering high above on every hand, and we saw that its altitude was just about that of the little Gasterthal, which we had visited the evening before. Still, it seemed a long way up in the air, in that waste and lonely wilderness of rocks. It had an unfenced grass plot in front of it, which seemed about as big as a billiard table, and this grass plot slanted so sharply downward, and was so brief, and ended so exceedingly soon at the verge of an absolute precipice, that it was a shuddery thing to think of a person's venturing to trust his foot on an incline so situated at all. Suppose a man stepped on an orange peel in that yard. There would be nothing for him to seize, nothing could keep him from rolling. 5 revolutions would bring him to the edge, and over he would go. What a frightful distance he would fall, for there are very few birds that fly as high as his starting point. He would strike and bounce 2 or 3 times on his way down, but this would be no advantage to him. I would as soon take an airing on the slant of a rainbow as in such a front yard. I would rather, in fact, for the distance down would be about the same, and it is pleasanter to slide than to bounce. I could not see how the peasants got up to that chalet. The region seemed too steep for anything but a balloon. As we strolled on, climbing up higher and higher, we were continually bringing neighboring peaks into view and lofty prominence which had been hidden behind lower peaks before. So, by and by, while standing before a group of these giants, we looked around for the chalet again. There it was, away down below us, apparently on an inconspicuous ridge in the valley. It was as far below us now as it had been above us when we were beginning the ascent. After a while the path led us along a railed precipice, and we looked over. Far beneath us was the snug parlor again, the little Gasternthal, with its water jets spouting from the face of its rock walls. We could have dropped a stone into it. We had been finding the top of the world all along, and always finding a still higher top stealing into view in a disappointing way just ahead. When we looked down into the Gasternthal we felt pretty sure that we had reached the genuine top at last. But it was not so. There were much higher altitudes to be scaled yet. We were still in the pleasant shade of forest trees. We were still in a region which was cushioned with beautiful mosses and aglow with the many-tinted luster of innumerable wildflowers. We found, indeed, more interest in the wildflowers than in anything else. We gathered a specimen or two of every kind which we were unacquainted with, so we had sumptuous bouquets. But one of the chief interests lay in chasing the seasons of the year up the mountain, and determining them by the presence of flowers and berries which we were acquainted with. For instance, it was the end of August at the level of the sea. In the Kandersteg Valley, at the base of the pass, we found flowers which would not be due at the sea level for 2 or 3 weeks. Higher up we entered October, and gathered fringed gentians. I made no notes, and have forgotten the details, but the construction of the floral calendar was very entertaining while it lasted. In the high regions we found rich store of the splendid red flower called the Alpine rose, but we did not find any examples of the ugly Swiss favorite called Edelweiss. Its name seems to indicate that it is a noble flower, and that it is white. It may be noble enough, but it is not attractive, and it is not white. The fuzzy blossom is the color of bad cigar ashes, and appears to be made of a cheap quality of gray plush. It has a noble and distant way of confining itself to the high altitudes, but that is probably on account of its looks. It apparently has no monopoly of those upper altitudes, however, for they are sometimes intruded upon by some of the loveliest of the valley families of wild flowers. Everybody in the Alps wears a sprig of edelweiss in his hat. It is the native's pet, and also the tourist's. All the morning, as we loafed along having a good time, other pedestrians went staving by us with vigorous strides, and with the intent and determined look of men who were walking for a wager. These wore loose knee-breeches, long yarn stockings, and hobnailed, high-laced walking shoes. They were gentlemen who would go home to England or Germany and tell how many miles they had beaten the guide-book every day. But I doubted if they ever had much real fun, outside of the mere magnificent exhilaration of the tramp through the green valleys and the breezy heights, for they were almost always alone, and even the finest scenery loses incalculably when there is no one to enjoy it with. All the morning an endless double procession of mule-mounted tourists filed past us along the narrow path, the one procession going, the other coming. We had taken a good deal of trouble to teach ourselves the kindly German custom of saluting all strangers with doffed hat, and we resolutely clung to it that morning, although it kept us bareheaded most of the time, and was not always responded to. Still, we found an interest in the thing, because we naturally liked to know who were English and Americans among the passers-by. All continental natives responded, of course. So did some of the English and Americans, but as a general thing these two races gave no sign. Whenever a man or a woman showed us cold neglect, we spoke up confidently in our own tongue and asked for such information as we happened to need, and we always got a reply in the same language. The English and American folk are not less kindly than other races, they are only more reserved, and that comes of habit and education. In one dreary, rocky waste, away above the line of vegetation, we met a procession of 25 mounted young men, all from America. We got answering bows enough from these, of course, for they were of an age to learn to do in Rome as Rome does, without much effort. At one extremity of this patch of desolation, overhung by bare and forbidding crags which husbanded drifts of everlasting snow in their shaded cavities, was a small stretch of thin and discouraged grass, and a man and a family of pigs were actually living here in some shanties. Consequently, this place could be really reckoned as property. It had a money value, and was doubtless taxed. I think it must have marked the limit of real estate in this world. It would be hard to set a money value upon any piece of earth that lies between that spot and the empty realm of space. That man may claim the distinction of owning the end of the world, for if there is any definite end to the world, he has certainly found it. From here forward we moved through a storm-swept and smileless desolation. All about us rose gigantic masses, crags, and ramparts of bare and dreary rock, with not a vestige or semblance of plant or tree or flower anywhere, or glimpse of any creature that had life. The frost and the tempests of unnumbered ages had battered and hacked at these cliffs with a deathless energy, destroying them piecemeal, so all the region about their bases was a tumbled chaos of great fragments which had been split off and hurled to the ground. Soiled and aged banks of snow lay close about our path. The ghastly desolation of the place was as tremendously complete as if Doré had furnished the working plans for it. But every now and then, through the stern gateways around us, we caught a view of some neighboring majestic dome, sheathed with glittering ice, and displaying its white purity at an elevation compared to which ours was groveling and plebeian, and this spectacle always chained one's interest and admiration at once, and made him forget there was anything ugly in the world. I have just said that there was nothing but death and desolation in these hideous places, but I forgot. In the most forlorn and arid and dismal one of all, where the racked and splintered debris was thickest, where the ancient patches of snow lay against the very path, where the winds blew bitterest and the general aspect was mournfulest and dreariest, and furthest from any suggestion of cheer or hope, I found a solitary wee forget-me-not flourishing away, not a droop about it anywhere, but holding its bright blue star up with the prettiest and gallantest air in the world, the only happy spirit, the only smiling thing in all that grisly desert. She seemed to say, "Cheer up! As long as we are here, let us make the best of it." I judged she had earned a right to a more hospitable place, so I plucked her up and sent her to America to a friend who would respect her for the fight she had made, all by her small self, to make a whole vast despondent alpine desolation stop breaking its heart over the unalterable, and hold up its head and look at the bright side of things for once. We stopped for a nooning at a strongly built little inn called the Schwarenbach. It sits in a lonely spot among the peaks, where it is swept by the trailing fringes of the cloud-rack, and is rained on and snowed on and pelted and persecuted by the storms nearly every day of its life. It was the only habitation in the whole Gemmi Pass. Close at hand now was a chance for a blood-curdling alpine adventure. Close at hand was the snowy mass of the great Altels, cooling its top-knot in the sky and daring us to an ascent. I was fired with the idea, and immediately made up my mind to procure the necessary guides, ropes, etc., and undertake it. I instructed Harris to go to the landlord of the inn and set him about our preparations. Meantime I went diligently to work to read up and find out what this much-talked-of mountain-climbing was like, and how one should go about it, for in these matters I was ignorant. I opened Mr. Hinchcliffe's Summer Months Among the Alps, published 1857, and selected his account of his ascent of Monte Rosa. It began, "It is very difficult to free the mind from excitement on the evening before a grand expedition." I saw that I was too calm, so I walked the room a while and worked myself into a high excitement, but the book's next remark, that the adventurer must get up at 2 in the morning, came as near as anything to flatting it all out again. However, I reinforced it, and read on, about how Mr. Hinchcliffe dressed by candlelight, and was soon down among the guides, who were bustling about in the passage, packing provisions, and making every preparation for the start; and how he glanced out into the cold clear night and saw that "the whole sky was blazing with stars, larger and brighter than they appear through the dense atmosphere breathed by inhabitants of the lower parts of the earth. They seemed actually suspended from the dark vault of heaven, and their gentle light shed a fairy-like gleam over the snow-fields around the foot of the Matterhorn, which raised its stupendous pinnacle on high, penetrating to the heart of the Great Bear, and crowning itself with a diadem of his magnificent stars. Not a sound disturbed the deep tranquillity of the night, except the distant roar of streams which rush from the high plateau of the St. Theodule Glacier and fall headlong over precipitous rocks till they lose themselves in the mazes of the Gorner Glacier. He took his hot toast and coffee, and then about half-past 3 his caravan of 10 men filed away from the Riffel Hotel and began the steep climb. At half-past 5 he happened to turn around and beheld the glorious spectacle of the Matterhorn, just touched by the rosy-fingered morning, and looking like a huge pyramid of fire rising out of the barren ocean of ice and rock around it. Then the Breithorn and the Dent Blanche caught the radiant glow, but the intervening mass of Monte Rosa made it necessary for us to climb many long hours before we could hope to see the sun himself, yet the whole air soon grew warmer after the splendid birth of the day. He gazed at the lofty crown of Monte Rosa, and the wastes of snow that guarded its steep approaches, and the chief guide delivered the opinion that no man could conquer their awful heights and put his foot upon that summit. But the adventurers moved steadily on, nevertheless. They toiled up, and still up. They passed the Grand Plateau, then toiled up a steep shoulder of the mountain, clinging like flies to its rugged face, and now they were confronted by a tremendous wall from which great blocks of ice and snow were evidently in the habit of falling. They turned aside to skirt this wall, and gradually ascended until their way was barred by a maze of gigantic snow crevices, So they turned aside again, and began a long climb of sufficient steepness to make a zigzag course necessary. Fatigue compelled them to halt frequently for a moment or two. At one of these halts somebody called out, "Look at Mont Blanc!" and we were at once made aware of the very great height we had attained by actually seeing the monarch of the Alps and his attendant satellites right over the top of Brighton, itself at least 14,000 feet high. These people moved in single file, and were all tied to a strong rope at regular distances apart, so that if one of them slipped on those giddy heights, the others could brace themselves on their alpenstocks and save him from darting into the valley thousands of feet below. By and by they came to an ice-coated ridge which was tilted up at a sharp angle and had a precipice on one side of it. They had to climb this, so the guide in the lead cut steps in the ice with his hatchet, and as fast as he took his toes out of one of these slight holes, the toes of the man behind him occupied it. Slowly and steadily we kept on our way over this dangerous part of the ascent, and I dare say it was fortunate for some of us that attention was distracted from the head by the paramount necessity of looking after the feet. For while on the left the incline of ice was so steep that it would be impossible for any man to save himself in case of a slip, unless the others could hold him up, on the right we might drop a pebble from the hand over precipices of unknown extent down upon the tremendous glacier below. Great caution, therefore, was absolutely necessary, and in this exposed situation we were attacked by all the fury of that grand enemy of aspirants to Monte Rosa, a severe and bitterly cold wind from the north. The fine powdery snow was driven past us in the clouds, penetrating the interstices of our clothes, and the pieces of ice which flew from the blows of Peter's axe were whisked into the air and then dashed over the precipice. We had quite enough to do to prevent ourselves from being served in the same ruthless fashion, and now and then, in the more violent gusts of wind, were glad to stick our alpenstocks into the ice and hold on hard. Having surmounted this perilous steep, they sat down and took a brief rest, with their backs against a sheltering rock, and their heels dangling over a bottomless abyss. Then they climbed to the base of another ridge, a more difficult and dangerous one still. The whole of the ridge was exceedingly narrow, and the fall on each side desperately steep. But the ice in some of these intervals between the masses of rock assumed the form of a mere sharp edge, almost like a knife. These places, though not more than 3 or 4 short paces in length, looked uncommonly awkward, but like the sword leading true believers to the gates of paradise, they must needs be passed before we could attain to the summit of our ambition. These were in 1 or 2 places so narrow that in stepping over them with toes well turned out for greater security, one end of the foot projected over the awful precipice on the right, while the other was on the beginning of the ice slope on the left, which was scarcely less steep than the rocks. On these occasions Peter would take my hand, and each of us stretching as far as we could, he was thus enabled to get a firm footing 2 paces or rather more from me, whence a spring would probably bring him to the rock on the other side. Then, turning around, he called to me to come, and taking a couple of steps carefully, I was met at the third by his outstretched hand ready to clasp mine, and in a moment stood by his side. The others followed in much the same fashion. Once my right foot slipped on the side toward the precipice, but I threw out my left arm in a moment so that it caught the icy edge under my armpit as I fell, and supported me considerably. At the same instant I cast my eyes down the side on which I had slipped, and contrived to plant my right foot on a piece of rock as large as a cricket ball, which chanced to protrude through the ice, on the very edge of the precipice. Being thus anchored fore and aft, as it were, I believe I could easily have recovered myself, even if I had been alone, though it must be confessed the situation would have been an awful one. As it was, however, a jerk from Peter settled the matter very soon, and I was on my legs all right in an instant. The rope is an immense help in places of this kind. Now they arrived at the base of a great knob or dome, veneered with ice and powdery with snow. The utmost summit, the last bit of solidity, between them and the hollow vault of heaven. They set to work with their hatchets, and were soon creeping, insect-like, up its surface, with their heels projecting over the thinnest kind of nothingness, thickened up a little with a few wandering shreds and films of cloud moving in a lazy procession far below. Presently one man's toe-hold broke, and he fell. There he dangled in mid-air at the end of the rope, like a spider, till his friends above hauled him into place again. A little bit later the party stood upon the wee pedestal of the very summit in a driving wind, and looked out upon the vast green expanses of Italy and a shoreless ocean of billowy Alps. When I had read thus far, Harris broke into the room in a noble excitement and said the ropes and the guides were secured, and asked if I was ready. I said I believed I wouldn't ascend the Altels this time. I said Alp climbing was a different thing from what I had supposed it was, and so I judged we had better study its points a little more before we went definitely into it. But I told him to retain the guides and order them to follow us to Zermatt, because I meant to use them there. I said I could feel the spirit of adventure beginning to stir in me, and was sure that the fell fascination of Alp climbing would soon be upon me. I said he could make up his mind to it that we would do a deed before we were a week older which would make the hair of the timid curl with fright. This made Harris happy, and filled him with ambitious anticipations. He went at once to tell the guides to follow us to Zermatt, and bring all their paraphernalia with them. End of chapter 34. This is chapter 35 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, chapter 35, Swindling the Coroner. A great and priceless thing is a new interest. How it takes possession of a man, how it clings to him, how it rides him. I strode onward from the Schwarenbach hostelry, a changed man, a reorganized personality. I walked into a new world. I saw with new eyes. I had been looking aloft at the giant show-peaks only as things to be worshipped for their grandeur and magnitude, and their unspeakable grace of form. I looked up at them now, as also things to be conquered and climbed. My sense of their grandeur and their noble beauty was neither lost nor impaired. I had gained a new interest in the mountains without losing the old ones. I followed the steep lines up, inch by inch, with my eye, and noted the possibility or impossibility of following them with my feet. When I saw a shining helmet of ice projecting above the clouds, I tried to imagine I saw files of black specks toiling up it roped together with a gossamer thread. We skirted the lonely little lake called d'Aubancy, and presently passed close by a glacier on the right, a thing like a great river, frozen solid in its flow, and broken square off like a wall at its mouth. I had never been so near a glacier before. Here we came upon a new board shanty, and found some men engaged in building a stone house. So the Schwarenbach was soon to have a rival. We bought a bottle or so of beer here. At any rate they called it beer, but I knew by the price that it was dissolved jewelry, and I perceived by the taste that dissolved jewelry is not good stuff to drink. We were surrounded by a hideous desolation. We stepped forward to a sort of jumping-off place, and were confronted by a startling contrast. We seemed to look down into fairyland. 2,000 or 3,000 feet below us was a bright green level, with a pretty town in its midst, and a silvery stream winding among the meadows. The charming spot was walled in on all sides by gigantic precipices clothed with pines, and over the pines, out of the softened distances, rose the snowy domes and peaks of the Monte Rosa region. How exquisitely green and beautiful that little valley down there was! The distance was not great enough to obliterate details. It only made them little and mellow and dainty, like landscapes and towns seen through the wrong end of a spyglass. Right under us a narrow ledge rose up out of the valley, with a green, slanting, bench-shaped top, and grouped about upon this green baize bench were a lot of black and white sheep, which looked merely like oversized worms. The bench seemed lifted well up into our neighborhood, but that was a deception. It was a long way down to it. We began our descent now by the most remarkable road I have ever seen. It wound its corkscrew curves down the face of the colossal precipice, a narrow way, with always the solid rock wall at one elbow and perpendicular nothingness at the other. We met an everlasting procession of guides, porters, mules, litters, and tourists climbing up this steep and muddy path, and there was no room to spare when you had to pass a tolerably fat mule. I always took the inside, when I heard or saw the mule coming, and flattened myself against the wall. I preferred the inside, of course, but I should have had to take it anyhow, because the mule prefers the outside. A mule's preference on the precipice is a thing to be respected. Well, his choice is always the outside. His life is mostly devoted to carrying bulky panniers and packages which rest against his body. Therefore he is habituated to taking the outside edge of mountain paths, to keep his bundles from rubbing against rocks or banks on the other. When he goes into the passenger business he absurdly clings to his old habit, and keeps one leg of his passenger always dangling over the great deeps of the lower world, while the passenger's heart is in the highlands, so to speak. More than once I saw a mule's hind foot cave over the outer edge, and send earth and rubbish into the bottom abyss, and I noticed that upon these occasions the rider, whether male or female, looked tolerably unwell. There was one place where an 18-inch breadth of light masonry had been added to the verge of the path, and as there was a very sharp turn here, a panel of fencing had been set up there at some time as a protection. This panel was old and gray and feeble, and the light masonry had been loosened by recent rains. A young American girl came along on a mule, and in making the turn the mule's hind foot caved all the loose masonry and one of the fence posts overboard. The mule gave a violent lurch inboard to save himself, and succeeded in the effort, but that girl turned as white as the snows of Mont Blanc for a moment. The path was simply a groove cut into the face of the precipice. There was a 4-foot breadth of solid rock under the traveler, and 4-foot breadth of solid rock just above his head, like the roof of a narrow porch. He could look out from this gallery and see a sheer summitless and bottomless wall of rock before him, across a gorge or crack a biscuit's toss in width, but he could not see the bottom of his own precipice unless he lay down and projected his nose over the edge. I did not do this, because I did not wish to soil my clothes. Every few hundred yards, at particularly bad places, one came across a panel or so of plank fencing, but they were always old and weak, and they generally leaned out over the chasm, and did not make any rash promises to hold up people who might need support. There was one of these panels which had only its upper board left. A pedestrianizing English youth came tearing down the path, was seized with an impulse to look over the precipice, and without an instant's thought he threw his weight upon that crazy board. It went outward a foot. I never made a gasp before that came so near to suffocating me. The English youth's face simply showed a lively surprise, but nothing more. He went swinging along valleyward again, as if he did not know he had just swindled a coroner by the closest kind of a shave. The Alpine litter is sometimes like a cushioned box made fast between the middles of 2 long poles, and sometimes it is a chair with a back to it and a support for the feet. It is carried by relays of strong porters. The motion is easier than that of any other conveyance. We met a few men and a great many ladies in litters. It seemed to me that most of the ladies looked pale and nauseated. Their general aspect gave me the idea that they were patiently enduring a horrible suffering. As a rule, they looked at their laps and left the scenery to take care of itself. But the most frightened creature I saw was a led horse that overtook us. Poor fellow, he had been born and reared in the grassy levels of the Kandersteg Valley, and had never seen anything like this hideous place before. Every few steps he would stop short, glance wildly out from the dizzy heights, and then spread his red nostrils wide and pant as violently as if he had been running a race. And all the while he quaked from head to heel as with a palsy. He was a handsome fellow, and he made a fine statuesque picture of terror, but it was pitiful to see him suffer so. This dreadful path has had its tragedy. Baedeker, with his customary over-terseness, begins and ends the tale thus: "The descent on horseback should be avoided. In 1861 a Comtesse d'Herlicourt fell from her saddle over the precipice and was killed on the spot." We looked over the precipice there, and saw the monument which commemorates the event. It stands in the bottom of the gorge, in a place which has been hollowed out of the rock to protect it from the torrent and the storms. Our old guide never spoke but when spoken to, and then limited himself to a syllable or two. But when we asked him about this tragedy, he showed a strong interest in the matter. He said the Comtesse was very pretty and very young, hardly out of her girlhood, in fact. She was newly married, and was on her bridal tour. The young husband was riding a little in advance. One guide was leading the husband's horse, another was leading the bride's. The old man continued, "The guide that was leading the husband's horse happened to glance back, and there was that poor young thing sitting up staring out over the precipice, and her face began to bend downward a little, and she put her 2 hands slowly and met it, so, and put them flat against her eyes, so, and then she sank out of the saddle with a sharp shriek, and one caught only the flash of a dress, and it was all over." Then, after a pause, "Ah, yes, that guide saw these things. Yes, he saw them all. He saw them all, just as I have told you." After another pause, "Ah, yes, he saw them all. My God, that was me. I was that guide." This had been the one event of the old man's life, so one may be sure he had forgotten no detail connected with it. We listened to all he had to say about what was done, and what happened, and what was said after the sorrowful occurrence, and a painful story it was. When we had wound down toward the valley until we were about on the last spiral of the corkscrew, Harris's hat blew over the last remaining bit of precipice, a small cliff 100 or 150 feet high, and sailed down toward a steep slant composed of rough chips and fragments which the weather had flaked away from the precipices. We went leisurely down there, expecting to find it without any trouble, but we had made a mistake as to that. We hunted during a couple of hours, not because the old straw hat was valuable, but out of curiosity to find out how such a thing could manage to conceal itself in open ground where there was nothing left for it to hide behind. When one is reading in bed, and lays his paper-knife down, he cannot find it again if it is smaller than a saber. That hat was as stubborn as any paper-knife could have been, and we finally had to give it up. But we found a fragment that had once belonged to an opera-glass, and by digging around and turning over the rocks we gradually collected all the lenses and cylinders and the various odds and ends that go to making up a complete opera-glass. We afterward had the thing reconstructed, and the owner can have his adventurous lost property by submitting proofs and paying costs of rehabilitation. We had hopes of finding the owner there, distributed around amongst the rocks, for it would have made an elegant paragraph, but we were disappointed. Still, we were far from being disheartened, for there was a considerable area which we had not thoroughly searched. We were satisfied he was there somewhere, so we resolved to wait over a day at Leuk and come back and get him. Then we sat down to polish off the perspiration and arrange about what we would do with him when we got him. Harris was for contributing him to the British Museum, but I was for mailing him to his widow. That is the difference between Harris and me. Harris is all for display. I am all for the simple right, even though I lose my money by it. Harris argued in favor of his proposition against mine, I argued in favor of mine and against his. The discussion warmed into a dispute. The dispute warmed into a quarrel. I finally said, very decidedly, "My mind is made up. He goes to the widow." Harris answered sharply, "And my mind is made up. He goes to the museum." I said calmly, "The museum may whistle when it gets him." Harris retorted, "The widow may save herself the trouble of whistling. for I will see that she never gets him." After some angry bandying of epithets, I said, "It seems to me that you are taking on a good many airs about these remains. I don't quite see what you've got to say about them." "I've got all to say about them. They'd never have been thought of if I hadn't found their opera-glass. The corpse belongs to me, and I'll do as I please with him." I was leader of the expedition, and all discoveries achieved by it naturally belonged to me. I was entitled to these remains, and could have enforced my right, but rather than have bad blood about the matter, I said we would toss up for them. I threw heads and won, but it was a barren victory, for although we spent all the next day searching, we never found a bone. I cannot imagine what could ever have become of that fellow. The town in the valley is called Leuk, or Leukerbad. We pointed our course toward it, down a verdant slope which was adorned with fringed gentians and other flowers, and presently entered the narrow alleys of the outskirts, and waded toward the middle of the town, through liquid fertilizer. They ought to either pave that village or organize a ferry. Harris's body was simply a chamois pasture. His person was populous with little hungry pests. His skin, when he stripped, was splotched like a scarlet fever patient's. So, when we were about to enter one of the Leukerbad inns, he noticed its signs, "Chamois Hotel." He refused to stop there. He said the chamois was plentiful enough without hunting up hotels where they made a specialty of it. I was indifferent, for the chamois is a creature that will neither bite me nor abide with me. But to calm Harris, we went to the Hôtel des Alpes. At the table d'hôte we had this for an incident. A very grave man, in fact his gravity amounted to solemnity and almost to austerity, sat opposite us, and he was tight, but doing his best to appear sober. He took up a corked bottle of wine, tilted it over his glass a while, then set it out of the way with a contented look, and went on with his dinner. Presently he put his glass to his mouth, and of course found it empty. He looked puzzled, and glanced furtively and suspiciously out of the corner of his eye at a benignant and unconscious old lady who sat at his right, shook his head as much to say, "No, she couldn't have done it." He tilted the corked bottle over his glass again, meantime searching around with his watery eye to see if anybody was watching him. He ate a few mouthfuls, raised his glass to his lips, and of course it was still empty. He bent an injured and accusing side-glance upon that unconscious old lady, which was a study to see. She went on eating, and gave no sign. He took up his glass and his bottle, with a wise private nod of his head, and set them gravely on the left-hand side of his plate, poured himself another imaginary drink, went to work with his knife and fork once more, presently lifted his glass with good confidence, and found it empty as usual. This was almost a petrifying surprise. He straightened himself up in his chair and deliberately and sorrowfully inspected the busy old ladies at his elbows, first one and then the other. At last he softly pushed his plate away, set his glass directly in front of him, held on to it with his left hand, and proceeded to pour with his right. This time he observed that nothing came. He turned the bottle clear upside down. Still nothing issued from it. A plaintive look came into his face, and he said, as if to himself, "They've got it all." Then he set the bottle down resignedly, and took the rest of his dinner dry. It was at that table d'hôte, too, that I had under inspection the largest lady I have ever seen in private life. She was over 7 feet high, and magnificently proportioned. What had first called my attention to her was my stepping on an outlying flange of her foot, and hearing, from up toward the ceiling, a deep, "Pardon, monsieur, but you encroach." That was when we were coming through the hall, and the place was dim, and I could see her only vaguely. The thing which called my attention to her the second time was that at a table beyond ours were 2 very pretty girls, and this great lady came in and sat down between them and me, and blotted out my view. She had a handsome face, and she was very finely formed, perfectly formed, I should say, but she made everybody around her look trivial and commonplace. Ladies near her looked like children, and the men about her looked mean. They looked like failures, and they looked as if they felt so, too. She sat with her back to us. I never saw such a back in my life. I would have so liked to see the moon rise over it. The whole congregation waited, under one pretext or another, till she finished her dinner and went out. They wanted to see her at full altitude, and they found it worth tarrying for. She filled one's idea of what an empress ought to be when she rose up in her unapproachable grandeur and moved superbly out of that place. We were not at Leuk in time to see her at her heaviest weight. She had suffered from corpulence and had come there to get rid of her extra flesh in the baths. 5 weeks of soaking, 5 uninterrupted hours of it every day, had accomplished her purpose and reduced her to the right proportions. Those baths remove fat and also skin diseases. The patients remain in the great tanks for hours at a time. A dozen gentlemen and ladies occupy a tank together, and amuse themselves with rompings and various games. They have floating desks and tables, and they read or lunch or play chess in water that is breast deep. The tourist can step in and view this novel spectacle if he chooses. There's a poor box, and he will have to contribute. There are several of these big bathing houses, and you can always tell when you are near one of them by the romping noises and shouts of laughter that proceed from it. The water is running water and changes all the time, else a patient with a ringworm might take the bath with only a partial success, since, while he was ridding himself of the ringworm, he might catch the itch. The next morning we wandered back up the green valley leisurely, with the curving walls of those bare and stupendous precipices rising into the clouds before us. I had never seen a clean, bare precipice stretching up 5,000 feet above me before, and I shall never expect to see another one. They exist, perhaps, but not in places where one can easily get close to them. This pile of stone is peculiar. From its base to the soaring tops of its mighty towers, all its lines and all its details vaguely suggest human architecture. There are rudimentary bow windows, cornices, chimneys, demarcations of stories, etc. One could sit and stare up there and study the features and exquisite graces of this grand structure, bit by bit, and day after day, and never weary his interest. The termination toward the town, observed in profile, is the perfection of shape. It comes down out of the clouds in a succession of rounded, colossal, terrace-like projections, a stairway for the gods. At its head spring several lofty, storm-scarred towers, one after another, with faint films of vapor curling always about them like spectral banners. If there were a king whose realms included the whole world, here would be the place meet and proper for such a monarch. He would only need to hollow it out and put in the electric light. He could give audience to a nation at a time under its roof. Our search for those remains having failed, we inspected with a glass the dim and distant track of an old-time avalanche that once swept down from some pine-grown summits behind the town and swept away the houses and buried the people. Then we struck down the road that leads toward the Rhone to see the famous ladders. These perilous things are built against the perpendicular face of a cliff 200 or 300 feet high. The peasants, of both sexes, were climbing up and down them with heavy loads on their backs. I ordered Harris to make the ascent, so I could put the thrill and horror of it in my book, and he accomplished the feat successfully, through a sub-agent, for 3 francs, which I paid. It makes me shudder yet when I think of what I felt when I was clinging there between heaven and earth in the person of that proxy. At times the world swam around me, and I could hardly keep from letting go, so dizzying was the appalling danger. Many a person would have given up and descended, but I stuck to my task and would not yield until I had accomplished it. I felt a just pride in my exploit, but I would not have repeated it for the wealth of the world. I shall break my neck yet with some such foolhardy performance, for warnings never seemed to have any lasting effect on me. When the people at the hotel found that I had been climbing those crazy ladders, it made me an object of considerable attention. Next morning, early, we drove to the Rhone Valley and took the train for Visp. There we shouldered our knapsacks and things and set out on foot in a tremendous rain, up the winding gorge toward Zermatt. Hour after hour we slopped along by the roaring torrent, and under noble Lesser Alps, which were clothed in rich velvety green all the way up, and had little atomy Swiss homes perched upon grassy benches along their mist-dimmed heights. The rain continued to pour and the torrent to boom, and we continued to enjoy both. At the one spot where this torrent tossed its white mane highest, and thundered loudest, and lashed the big boulders fiercest, the canton had done itself the honor to build the flimsiest wooden bridge that existed in the world. While we were walking over it along with a party of horsemen, I noticed that even the larger raindrops made it shake. I called Harris's attention to it, and he noticed it too. It seemed to me that if I owned an elephant that was a keepsake, and I thought a good deal of him, I would think twice before I would ride him over that bridge. We climbed up to the village of St. Nicholas about 4:30 in the afternoon, waded ankle-deep through the fertilizer juice, and stopped at a new and nice hotel close by the little church. We stripped and went to bed, and sent our clothes down to be baked, and the horde of soaked tourists did the same. That chaos of clothing got mixed in the kitchen, and there were consequences. I did not get back the same drawers I sent down when our things came up at 6:15. I got a pair on a new plan. They were merely a pair of white ruffle-cuffed absurdities, hitched together at the top with a narrow band, and they did not come quite down to my knees. They were pretty enough, but they made me feel like two people, and disconnected at that. The man must have been an idiot that got himself up like that, to rough it in the Swiss mountains. The shirt they brought me was shorter than the drawers, and hadn't any sleeves to it. At least it hadn't anything more than what Mr. Darwin would call rudimentary sleeves. These had edging around them, but the bosom was ridiculously plain. The knit silk undershirt they brought me was on a new plan, and was really a sensible thing. It opened behind, and had pockets in it to put your shoulder-blades in, but they did not seem to fit mine, and so I found it a sort of uncomfortable garment. They gave my bobtail coat to somebody else, and sent me an ulster suitable for a giraffe. I had to tie my collar on, because there was no button behind on that foolish little shirt which I described a while ago. When I was dressed for dinner at 6:30, I was too loose in some places and too tight in others, and altogether I felt slovenly and ill-conditioned. However, the people at the table d'hôte were no better off than I was. They had everybody's clothes but their own on. A long stranger recognized his ulster as soon as he saw the tail of it, following me in, but nobody claimed my shirt or my drawers, though I described them as well as I was able. I gave them to the chambermaid that night when I went to bed, and she probably found the owner, for my own things were on a chair outside my door in the morning. There was a lovable English clergyman who did not get to the table d'hôte at all. His breeches had turned up missing, and without any equivalent. He said he was not more particular than other people, but he had noticed that a clergyman at dinner without any breeches was almost sure to excite remark. End of chapter 35. This is chapter 36 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, chapter 36, The Fiendish Fun of Alp Climbing. We did not oversleep at St. Nicholas. The church bell began to ring at 4:30 in the morning, and from the length of time it continued to ring, I judged that it takes the Swiss sinner a good while to get the invitation through his head. Most church bells in the world are of poor quality, and have a harsh and rasping sound which upsets the temper and produces much sin. But the St. Nicholas bell is a good deal the worst one that has been contrived yet, and is peculiarly maddening in its operation. Still, it may have its right and its excuse to exist, for the community is poor, and not every citizen can afford a clock, perhaps. But there cannot be any excuse for our church bells at home, for there is no family in America without a clock, and consequently there is no fair pretext for the usual Sunday medley of dreadful sounds that issues from our steeples. There is much more profanity in America on Sunday than in all the other 6 days of the week put together, and it is of a more bitter and malignant character than the weekday profanity, too. It is produced by the cracked-pot clangor of the cheap church bells. We build our churches almost without regard to cost. We rear an edifice which is an adornment to the town, and we gild it, and fresco it, and mortgage it, and do everything we can think of to perfect it, and then spoil it all by putting a bell on it which afflicts everybody who hears it, giving some the headache, others St. Vitus's dance, and the rest the blind staggers. An American village at 10 o'clock on a summer Sunday is the quietest and peacefulest and holiest thing in nature, but it is a pretty different thing half an hour later. Mr. Poe's poem of the Bells stands incomplete to this day, but it is well enough that it is so, for the public reciter or reader who goes around trying to imitate the sounds of the various sorts of bells with his voice would find himself up a stump when he got to the church bell, as Joseph Addison would say. The church is always trying to get other people to reform. It might not be a bad idea to reform itself a little by way of example. It is still clinging to one or two things which were useful once, but which are not useful now, neither are they ornamental. One is the bell-ringing to remind a clock-caked town that it is church time, and another is the reading from the pulpit of a tedious list of notices which everybody who is interested has already read in the newspaper. The clergyman even reads the hymn through, a relic of an ancient time when hymn-books are scarce and costly. But everybody has a hymn-book now, and so the public reading is no longer necessary. It is not merely unnecessary, it is generally painful, for the average clergyman could not fire into his congregation with a shotgun and hit a worse reader than himself, unless the weapon scattered shamefully. I am not meaning to be flippant and irreverent, I am only meaning to be truthful. The average clergyman, in all countries and of all denominations, is a very bad reader. One would think he would at least learn how to read the Lord's Prayer by and by, but it is not so. He races through it as if he thought the quicker he got it in, the sooner it would be answered. A person who does not appreciate the exceeding value of pauses, and does not know how to measure their duration judiciously, cannot render the grand simplicity and dignity of a composition like that effectively. We took a tolerably early breakfast, and tramped off toward Zermatt through the reeking lanes of the village, glad to get away from that bell. By and by we had a fine spectacle on our right. It was the wall-like butt-end of a huge glacier, which looked down on us from an alpine height which was well up in the blue sky. It was an astonishing amount of ice to be compacted together in one mass. We ciphered upon it, and decided that it was not less than several hundred feet from the base of the wall of solid ice to the top of it. Harris believed it was really twice that. We judged that if St. Paul's, St. Peter's, the Great Pyramid, the Strasbourg Cathedral, and the Capitol in Washington were clustered against that wall, a man sitting on its upper edge could not hang his hat on the top of any one of them without reaching down 300 or 400 feet, a thing which, of course, no man could do. To me, that mighty glacier was very beautiful. I did not imagine that anybody could find fault with it, but I was mistaken. Harris had been snarling for several days. He was a rabid Protestant, and he was always saying, "In the Protestant cantons you never see such poverty and dirt and squalor as you do in this Catholic one. You never see the lanes and alleys flowing with foulness. You never see such wretched little sties of houses. You never see an inverted tin turnip on top of the church for a dome. And as for a church bell, why, you never hear a church bell at all." All this morning he had been finding fault straight along. First it was with the mud. He said, "It ain't muddy in a Protestant canton when it rains." Then it was with the dogs. "They don't have those lop-eared dogs in a Protestant canton." Then it was with the roads. "They don't leave the roads to make themselves in a Protestant canton. The people make them, and they make a road that is a road, too." Next it was the goats. "You never see a goat shedding tears in a Protestant canton. A goat there is one of the cheerfulest objects in nature. Next it was the chamois. You never see a Protestant chamois act like one of these. They take a bite or two and go, but these fellows camp with you and stay. Then it was the guide boards. In a Protestant canton you couldn't get lost if you wanted to, but you never see a guide board in a Catholic canton. Next, you never see any flower boxes in the windows here. Never anything but now and then a cat, a torpid one. But you take a Protestant canton, windows perfectly lovely with flowers, and as for cats, there's just acres of them. These folks in this canton leave a road to make itself, and then fine you 3 francs if you trot over it, as if a horse could trot over such a sarcasm of a road. Next, about the goiter. They talk about goiter. I haven't seen a goiter in this whole canton that I couldn't put in a hat. He had growled at everything, but I judged it would puzzle him to find anything the matter with this majestic glacier. I intimated as much, but he was ready, and said with a surly discontent, "You ought to see them in the Protestant cantons." This irritated me, but I concealed the feeling and asked, "What is the matter with this one?" "Matter? Why, it ain't in any kind of condition. They never take any care of a glacier here. The moraine has been spilling gravel around it and got it all dirty." "Why, man, they can't help that." "They? You're right. That is, they won't. They could if they wanted to. You never see a speck of dirt on a Protestant glacier. Look at the Rhone glacier. It is 15 miles long and 700 feet thick. If this was a Protestant glacier, you wouldn't see it looking like this, I can tell you." "That is nonsense. What would they do with it?" "They would whitewash it. They always do." I did not believe a word of this, but rather than have trouble, I let it go, for it is a waste of breath to argue with a bigot. I even doubted if the Rhone glacier was in a Protestant canton, but I did not know, so I could not make anything by contradicting a man who would probably put me down at once with manufactured evidence. About 9 miles from St. Nicholas we crossed a bridge over the raging torrent of the Visp, and came to a log strip of flimsy fencing which was pretending to secure people from tumbling over a perpendicular wall 40 feet high and into the river. 3 children were approaching. One of them, a little girl about 8 years old, was running. When pretty close to us she stumbled and fell, and her feet shot under the rail of the fence and for a moment projected over the stream. It gave us a sharp shock, for we thought she was gone, sure, for the ground slanted steeply, and to save herself seemed a sheer impossibility. But she managed to scramble up and ran by us laughing. We went forward and examined the place, and saw the long tracks which her feet had made in the dirt when they darted over the verge. If she had finished her trip, she would have struck some big rocks in the edge of the water, and then the torrent would have snatched her downstream among the half-covered boulders, and she would have been pounded to pulp in 2 minutes. We had come exceedingly near witnessing her death. And now Harris's contrary nature and inborn selfishness were strikingly manifested. He has no spirit of self-denial. He began straight off, and continued for an hour, to express his gratitude that the child was not destroyed. I never saw such a man. That was the kind of person he was. Just so he was gratified, he never cared anything about anybody else. I had noticed that trait in him over and over again. Often, of course, it was mere heedlessness, mere want of reflection. Doubtless this may have been the case in most instances, but it was not the less hard to bar on that account, and, after all, its bottom, its groundwork, was selfishness. There is no avoiding that conclusion. In the instance under consideration, I did think the indecency of running on in that way might occur to him, but no, the child was saved, and he was glad. That was sufficient. He cared not a straw for my feelings, or my loss of such a literary plum, snatched from my very mouth at the instant it was ready to drop into it. His selfishness was sufficient to place his own gratification in being spared suffering clear before all concern for me, his friend. Apparently he did not once reflect upon the valuable details, which would have fallen like a windfall to me, fishing the child out, witnessing the surprise of the family and the stir the thing would have made among the peasants, then a Swiss funeral, then the roadside monument, to be paid for by us and have our names mentioned in it. And we should have gone into Baedeker and been immortal. I was silent. I was too much hurt to complain. If he could act so, and be so heedless and so frivolous at such a time, and actually seem to glory in it, after all I had done for him, I would have cut my hand off before I would let him see that I was wounded. We were approaching Zermatt. Consequently, we were approaching the renowned Matterhorn. A month before, this mountain had been only a name to us, but latterly we had been moving through a steadily thickening double row of pictures of it, done in oil, water, chromo, wood, steel, copper, crayon, and photography, and so it had at length become a shape to us, and a very distinct, decided, and familiar one, too. We were expecting to recognize that mountain whenever or wherever we should run across it. We were not deceived. The monarch was far away when we first saw him, but there was no such thing as mistaking him. He has the rare peculiarity of standing by himself. He is peculiarly steep, too, and is also most oddly shaped. He towers into the sky like a colossal wedge, with the upper third of its blade bent a little to the left. The broad base of this monster wedge is planted upon a grand glacier-paved alpine platform whose elevation is 10,000 feet above sea level. As the wedge itself is some 5,000 feet high, it follows that its apex is about 15,000 feet above sea level. So the whole bulk of this stately piece of rock, this sky-cleaving monolith, is above the line of eternal snow. Yet, while all its giant neighbors have the look of being built of solid snow from their waists up, the Matterhorn stands black and naked and forbidding the year round, or merely powdered or streaked with white in places, for its sides are so steep that the snow cannot stay there. Its strange form, its august isolation, and its majestic unkinship with its own kind make it, so to speak, the Napoleon of the mountain world. Grand, gloomy, and peculiar is a phrase which fits it as aptly as it fitted the great captain. Think of a monument a mile high, standing on a pedestal 2 miles high. This is what the Matterhorn is, a monument. Its office, henceforth, for all time, will be to watch and ward over the secret resting-place of the young Lord Douglas, who, in 1865, was precipitated from the summit over a precipice 4,000 feet high, and never seen again. No man ever had such a monument as this before. The most imposing of the world's other monuments are but atoms compared to it, and they will perish, and their places will pass from memory, but this will remain. Footnote number 1. The accident which cost Lord Douglas his life, see Chapter 12, also cost the lives of 3 other men. These 3 fell 4/5 of a mile, and their bodies were afterward found, lying side by side upon a glacier, whence they were borne to Zermatt and buried in the churchyard. The remains of Lord Douglas have never been found. The secret of his sepulture, like that of Moses, must remain a mystery always. A walk from St. Nicholas to Zermatt is a wonderful experience. Nature is built on a stupendous plan in that region. One marches continually between walls that are piled into the skies, with their upper heights broken into a confusion of sublime shapes that gleam white and cold against the background of blue. And here and there one sees a big glacier displaying its grandeurs on the top of a precipice, or a graceful cascade leaping and flashing down the green declivities. There is nothing tame or cheap or trivial. It is all magnificent. That short valley is a picture gallery of a notable kind, for it contains no mediocrities. From end to end the Creator has hung it with his masterpieces. We made Zermatt at 3 in the afternoon, 9 hours out from St. Nicholas. Distance, by guide-book, 12 miles. By pedometer, 72. We were in the heart and home of the mountain climbers now, as all visible things testified. The snow-peaks did not hold themselves aloof in an aristocratic reserve. They nestled close around in a friendly, sociable way. guides, with the ropes and axes and other implements of their fearful calling slung about their persons, roosted in a long line upon a stone wall in front of the hotel, and waited for customers. Sunburnt climbers, in mountaineering costume, and followed by their guides and porters, arrived from time to time, from breakneck expeditions among the peaks and glaciers of the high Alps. Male and female tourists on mules filed by, in a continuous procession, hotelward bound from wild adventures which would grow in grandeur every time they were described at the English or American fireside, and at last outgrow the possible itself. We were not dreaming. This was not a make-believe home of the Alp climber, created by our heated imaginations. No, for here was Mr. Girdlestone himself, the famous Englishman who hunts his way to the most formidable Alpine summits without a guide. I was not equal to imagining a Girdlestone. It was all I could do to even realize him while looking straight at him at short range. I would rather face whole Hyde Parks of artillery than the ghastly forms of death which he has faced among the peaks and precipices of the mountains. There is probably no pleasure equal to the pleasure of climbing a dangerous Alp, but it is a pleasure which is confined strictly to people who can find pleasure in it. I have not jumped to this conclusion. I have traveled to it per gravel train, so to speak. I have thought the thing all out, and am quite sure I am right. A born climber's appetite for climbing is hard to satisfy. When it comes upon him, he is like a starving man with a feast before him. He may have other business on hand, but it must wait. Mr. Girdlestone had had his usual summer holiday in the Alps, and had spent it in his usual way, hunting for unique chances to break his neck. His vacation was over, and his luggage packed for England, but all of a sudden a hunger had come upon him to climb the tremendous Weisshorn once more, for he had heard of a new and utterly impossible route up it. His baggage was unpacked at once, and now he and a friend, laden with knapsacks, ice-picks, coils of rope, and canteens of milk, were just setting out. They would spend the night high up among the snows somewhere, and get up at 2 in the morning and finish the enterprise. I had a strong desire to go with them, but forced it down, a feat which Mr. Girdlestone, with all his fortitude, could not do. Even ladies catch the climbing mania, and are unable to throw it off. A famous climber of that sex had attempted the Weisshorn a few days before our arrival, and she and her guides had lost their way in a snowstorm high up among the peaks and glaciers, and had been forced to wander around a good while before they could find a way down. When this lady reached the bottom, she had been on her feet 23 hours. Our guides, hired on the Gemmi, were already at Zermatt when we reached there, so there was nothing to interfere with our getting up an adventure whenever we should choose the time and the object. I resolved to devote my first evening in Zermatt to studying up the subject of Alpine climbing by way of preparation. I read several books, and here are some of the things I found out. One's shoes must be strong and heavy, and have pointed hobnails in them. The alpenstock must be of the best wood, for if it should break, loss of life might be the result. One should carry an axe to cut steps in the ice with on the great heights. There must be a ladder, for there are steep bits of rock which can be surmounted with this instrument, or this utensil, which could not be surmounted without it. Such an obstruction has compelled the tourist to waste hours hunting another route, when a ladder would have saved him all trouble. One must have from 150 to 500 feet of strong rope to be used in lowering the party down steep declivities which are too steep and smooth to be traversed in any other way. One must have a steel hook on another rope, a very useful thing, for when one is ascending and comes to a low bluff which is yet too high for the ladder, he swings this rope aloft like a lasso. The hook catches at the top of the bluff, and then the tourist climbs the rope hand over hand, being always particular to try and forget that if the hook gives way he will never stop falling till he arrives in some part of Switzerland where they are not expecting him. Another important thing, there must be a rope to tie the whole party together with, so that if one falls from a mountain or down a bottomless chasm in a glacier, the others may brace back on the rope and save him. One must have a silk veil to protect his face from snow, sleet, hail, and gale, and colored goggles to protect his eyes from that dangerous enemy, snow-blindness. Finally, there must be some porters to carry provisions, wine, and scientific instruments, and also blanket bags for the party to sleep in. I closed my readings with a fearful adventure which Mr. Whymper once had on the Matterhorn when he was prowling around alone 5,000 feet above the town of Breil. He was edging his way gingerly around the corner of a precipice where the upper edge of a sharp declivity of ice-glazed snow joined it. This declivity swept down a couple of 100 feet into a gully which curved around and ended at a precipice 800 feet high, overlooking a glacier. His foot slipped, and he fell. He says, "My knapsack brought my head down first, and I pitched into some rocks about a dozen feet below. They caught something and tumbled me off the edge, head over heels, into the gully. The baton was dashed from my hands, and I whirled downward in a series of bounds, each longer than the last, now over ice, now into rocks, striking my head 4 or 5 times, each time with increased force. The last bound sent me spinning through the air in a leap of 50 or 60 feet from one side of the gully to the other, and I struck the rocks, luckily, with the whole of my left side. They caught my clothes for a moment, and I fell back to the snow with motion arrested. My head fortunately came the right side up, and a few frantic catches brought me to a halt, in the neck of the gully and on the verge of the precipice. Baton, hat, and veil skimmed by and disappeared, and the crash of the rocks, which I had started, as they fell on to the glacier, told how narrow had been the escape from utter destruction. As it was, I fell nearly 200 feet in 7 or 8 bounds. 10 feet more would have taken me in one gigantic leap of 800 feet on to the glacier below. The situation was sufficiently serious. The rocks could not be let go for a moment, and the blood was spurting out of more than 20 cuts. The most serious ones were in the head, and I vainly tried to close them with one hand, while holding on with the other. It was useless. The blood gushed out in blinding jets at each pulsation. At last, in a moment of inspiration, I kicked out a big lump of snow and stuck it as plaster on my head. The idea was a happy one, and the flow of blood diminished. Then, scrambling up, I got, not a moment too soon, to a place of safety, and fainted away. The sun was setting when consciousness returned, and it was pitch dark before the great staircase was descended. But by a combination of luck and care, the whole 4,700 feet of descent to Breil was accomplished without a slip or once missing the way. His wounds kept him abed some days. Then he got up and climbed that mountain again. That is the way with a true Alp climber. The more fun he has, the more he wants. End of chapter 36. This is chapter 37. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, Chapter 37. Our imposing column starts upward. After I had finished my readings, I was no longer myself. I was tranced, uplifted, intoxicated by the almost incredible perils and adventures I had been following my authors through, and the triumphs I had been sharing with them. I sat silent some time, then turned to Harris and said, "My mind is made up." Something in my tone struck him, and when he glanced at my eye and read what was written there, his face paled perceptibly. He hesitated a moment, then said, "Speak." I answered with perfect calmness, "I will ascend the Riffelberg." If I had shot my poor friend, he could not have fallen from his chair more suddenly. If I had been his father, he could not have pleaded harder to get me to give up my purpose. But I turned a deaf ear to all he said. When he perceived at last that nothing could alter my determination, he ceased to urge, and for a while the deep silence was broken only by his sobs. I sat in marble resolution, with my eyes fixed upon vacancy, for in spirit I was already wrestling with the perils of the mountains, and my friend sat gazing at me in adoring admiration through his tears. At last he threw himself upon me in a loving embrace and exclaimed in broken tones, "Your Harris will never desert you. We will die together." I cheered the noble fellow with praises, and soon his fears were forgotten, and he was eager for the adventure. He wanted to summon the guides at once and leave at 2 in the morning, as he supposed the custom was, but I explained that nobody was looking at that hour, and that the start in the dark was not usually made from the village, but from the first night's resting-place on the mountainside. I said we would leave the village at 3 or 4 p.m. on the morrow. Meantime he could notify the guides, and also let the public know of the attempt which we proposed to make. I went to bed, but not to sleep. No man can sleep when he is about to undertake one of these Alpine exploits. I tossed feverishly all night long, and was glad enough when I heard the clock strike 11:30 and knew it was time to get up for dinner. I rose, jaded and rusty, and went to the noon meal, where I found myself the center of interest and curiosity, for the news was already abroad. It is not easy to eat calmly when you are a lion, but it is very pleasant nevertheless. As usual at Zermatt, when a great ascent is about to be undertaken, everybody, native and foreign, laid aside his own projects and took up a good position to observe the start. The expedition consisted of 198 persons, including the mules, or 205, including the cows, as follows: chiefs of service, myself, Mr. Harris, 17 guides, 4 surgeons, 1 geologist, 1 botanist, 3 chaplains, 2 draftsmen, 15 barkeepers, 1 Latinist. Subordinates: 1 veterinary surgeon, 1 butler, 12 waiters, 1 footman, 1 barber, 1 head cook, 9 assistants, 4 pastry cooks, 1 confectionery artist. Transportation, etc.: 27 porters, 44 mules, 44 muleteers, 3 coarse washers and ironers, 1 fine ditto, 7 cows, 2 milkers. Total, 154 men, 51 animals, grand total, 205. Rations, etc.: 16 cases hams, 2 barrels flour, 22 barrels whiskey, 1 barrel sugar, 1 keg lemons, 2,000 cigars, 1 barrel pies, 1 ton of pemmican, 143 pair crutches, 2 barrels arnica, 1 bale of lint, 27 kegs paregoric. Apparatus: 25 spring mattresses, 2 hair ditto, bedding for same, 2 mosquito nets, 29 tents, scientific instruments, 97 ice axes, 5 cases dynamite, 7 cans nitroglycerin, 22 40-foot ladders, 2 miles of rope, 154 umbrellas. It was full 4 o'clock in the afternoon before my cavalcade was entirely ready. At that hour it began to move. In point of numbers and spectacular effect it was the most imposing expedition that had ever marched from Zermatt. I commanded the chief guide to arrange the men and animals in single file, 12 feet apart, and lash them all together on a strong rope. He objected that the first 2 miles was a dead level, with plenty of room, and that the rope was never used except in very dangerous places. But I would not listen to that. My reading had taught me that many serious accidents had happened in the Alps simply from not having the people tied up soon enough. I was not going to add one to the list. The guide then obeyed my order. When the procession stood at ease, roped together and ready to move, I never saw a finer sight. It was 3,122 feet long, over half a mile. Every man and me was on foot, and had on his green veil and his blue goggles, and his white rag around his hat, and his coil of rope over one shoulder and under the other, and his ice-axe in his belt, and carried his alpenstock in his left hand, his umbrella closed in his right, and his crutches slung at his back. The burdens of the pack-mules and the horns of the cows were decked with edelweiss and the Alpine rose. I and my agent were the only persons mounted. We were in the post of danger in the extreme rear, and tied securely to 5 guides apiece. Our armor-bearers carried our ice-axes, alpenstocks, and other implements for us. We were mounted upon very small donkeys, as a measure of safety. In time of peril we could straighten our legs and stand up and let the donkey walk from under. Still, I cannot recommend this sort of animal, at least for excursions of mere pleasure, because his ears interrupt the view. I and my agent possessed the regulation mountaineering costumes, but concluded to leave them behind. Out of respect for the great numbers of tourists of both sexes who would be assembled in front of the hotels to see us pass, and also out of respect for the many tourists whom we expected to encounter on our expedition, we decided to make the ascent in evening dress. We watered the caravan at the cold stream which rushes down a trough near the end of the village, and soon afterward left the haunts of civilization behind us. About half-past 5 o'clock we arrived at a bridge which spans the Visp, and after throwing over a detachment to see if it was safe, the caravan crossed without accident. The way now led by a gentle ascent, carpeted with fresh green grass, to the church at Winkelmatten. Without stopping to examine this edifice, I executed a flank movement to the right, and crossed the bridge over the Findelenbach, after first testing its strength. Here I deployed to the right again, and presently entered an inviting stretch of meadowland which was unoccupied save by a couple of deserted huts toward the furthest extremity. These meadows offered an excellent camping place. We pitched our tents, supped, established a proper grade, recorded the events of the day, and then went to bed. We rose at 2 in the morning and dressed by candlelight. It was a dismal and chilly business. A few stars were shining, but the general heavens were overcast, and the great shaft of the Matterhorn was draped in a cable pall of clouds. The chief guide advised a delay. He said he feared it was going to rain. We waited until 9 o'clock, and then got away in tolerably clear weather. Our course led up some terrific steeps, densely wooded with larches and cedars, and traversed by paths which the rains had guttered, and which were obstructed by loose stones. To add to the danger and inconvenience, we were constantly meeting returning tourists on foot and horseback, and as constantly being crowded and battered by ascending tourists who were in a hurry and wanted to get by. Our troubles thickened. About the middle of the afternoon, the 17 guides called a halt and held a consultation. After consulting an hour, they said their first suspicion remained intact, that is to say, they believed they were lost. I asked if they did not know it. No, they said they couldn't absolutely know whether they were lost or not, because none of them had ever been in that part of the country before. They had a strong instinct that they were lost, but they had no proofs, except that they did not know where they were. They had met no tourists for some time, and they considered that a suspicious sign. Plainly, we were in an ugly fix. The guides were naturally unwilling to go alone and seek a way out of the difficulty, so we all went together. For better security we moved slow and cautiously, for the forest was very dense. We did not move up the mountain, but around it, hoping to strike across the old trail. Toward nightfall, when we were about tired out, we came up against a rock as big as a cottage. This barrier took all the remaining spirit out of the men, and a panic of fear and despair ensued. They moaned and wept, and said they should never see their homes and their dear ones again. Then they began to upbraid me for bringing them upon this fatal expedition. Some even muttered threats against me. Clearly it was no time to show weakness, so I made a speech in which I said that other Alp climbers had been in as perilous a position as this, and yet by courage and perseverance had escaped. I promised to stand by them and promised to rescue them. I closed by saying we had plenty of provisions to maintain us for quite a siege, and did they suppose Zermatt would allow half a mile of men and mules to mysteriously disappear during any considerable time, right above their noses, and make no inquiries? No. Zermatt would send out searching expeditions, and we should be saved. This speech had a great effect. The men pitched the tents with some little show of cheerfulness, and we were snugly under cover when the night shut down. I now reap the reward of my wisdom in providing one article which is not mentioned in any book of Alpine adventure but this. I refer to the paregoric. But for that beneficent drug, not one of those men would have slept a moment during that fearful night. But for that gentle persuader, they must have tossed unsoothed the night through, for the whiskey was for me. Yes, they would have risen in the morning unfitted for their heavy task. As it was, everybody slept but my agent and me. Only we, and the barkeepers. I would not permit myself to sleep at such a time. I considered myself responsible for all those lives. I meant to be on hand and ready in case of avalanches up there, but I did not know it then. We watched the weather all through that awful night, and kept an eye on the barometer, to be prepared for the least change. There was not the slightest change recorded by the instrument during the whole time. Words cannot describe the comfort that that friendly, hopeful, steadfast thing was to me in that season of trouble. It was a defective barometer, and had no hand but the stationary brass pointer. But I did not know that until afterward. If I should be in such a situation again, I should not wish for any barometer but that one. All hands rose at 2 in the morning, and took breakfast, and as soon as it was light we roped ourselves together and went at that rock. For some time we tried the hook rope and other means of scaling it, but without success, that is, without perfect success. The hook caught once, and Harris started up it hand over hand, but the hold broke, and if there had not happened to be a chaplain sitting underneath at the time, Harris would certainly have been crippled. As it was the chaplain. He took to his crutches, and I ordered the hook rope to be laid aside. It was too dangerous an implement where so many people are standing around. We were puzzled for a while. Then somebody thought of the ladders. One of these was leaned against the rock, and the men went up it tied together in couples. Another ladder was sent up for use in descending. At the end of half an hour everybody was over, and that rock was conquered. We gave our first grand shout of triumph, but the joy was short-lived, for somebody asked how we were going to get the animals over. This was a serious difficulty. In fact, it was an impossibility. The courage of the men began to waver immediately. Once more we were threatened with a panic, but when the danger was most imminent, we were saved in a mysterious way. A mule, which had attracted attention from the beginning by its disposition to experiment, tried to eat a 5-pound can of nitroglycerin. This happened right alongside the rock. The explosion threw us all to the ground, and covered us with dirt and debris. It frightened us extremely, too, for the crash it made was deafening, and the violence of the shock made the ground tremble. However, we were grateful, for the rock was gone. Its place was occupied by a new cellar, about 30 feet across by 15 feet deep. The explosion was heard as far as Zermatt, and an hour and a half afterward many citizens of that town were knocked down and quite seriously injured by descending portions of mule meat, frozen solid. This shows better than any estimate in figures how high the experimenter went. We had nothing to do now but bridge the cellar and proceed on our way. With a cheer the men went at their work. I attended to the engineering myself. I appointed a strong detail to cut down trees with ice-axes and trim them for piers to support the bridge. This was a slow business, for ice-axes are not good to cut wood with. I caused my piers to be firmly set up in ranks in the cellar, and upon them I laid 6 of my 40-foot ladders, side by side, and laid 6 more on top of them. Upon this bridge I caused a bed of boughs to be spread, and on top of the boughs a bed of earth 6 inches deep. I stretched ropes upon either side to serve as railings, and then my bridge was complete. A train of elephants could have crossed it in safety and comfort. By nightfall the caravan was on the other side, and the ladders were taken up. Next morning we went on in good spirits for a while, though our way was slow and difficult, by reason of the steep and rocky nature of the ground and the thickness of the forest. But at last a dull despondency crept into the men's faces, and it was apparent that not only they but even the guides were now convinced that we were lost. The fact that we still met no tourists was a circumstance that was but too significant. Another thing seemed to suggest that we were not only lost, but very badly lost, for there must surely be searching parties on the road before this time, yet we had seen no sign of them. Demoralization was spreading. Something must be done, and done quickly, too. Fortunately, I am not unfertile in expedients. I contrived one now which commended itself to all, for it promised well. I took 3/4 of a mile of rope and fastened one end of it around the waist of a guide, and told him to go find the road, while the caravan waited. I instructed him to guide himself back by the rope in case of failure. In case of success, he was to give the rope a series of violent jerks, whereupon the expedition would go to him at once. He departed, and in 2 minutes had disappeared among the trees. I paid out the rope myself, while everybody watched the crawling thing with eager eyes. The rope crept away quite slowly at times, and at other times with some briskness. Twice or thrice we seemed to get the signal, and a shout was just ready to break from the men's lips when they perceived it was a false alarm. But at last, when over half a mile of rope had slidden away, it stopped gliding and stood absolutely still, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3, while we held our breath and watched. Was the guide resting? Was he scanning the country from some high point? Was he inquiring of a chance mountaineer? Stop! Had he fainted from excess of fatigue and anxiety? This thought gave us a shock. I was in the very first act of detailing an expedition to succor him, when the cord was assailed with a series of such frantic jerks that I could hardly keep hold of it. The huzzah that went up then was good to hear. "Saved! Saved!" was the word that rang out all down the long rank of the caravan. We rose up and started at once. We found the route to be good enough for a while, but it began to grow difficult by and by, and this feature steadily increased. When we judged we had gone half a mile, we momentarily expected to see the guide, but no, he was not visible anywhere. Neither was he waiting, for the rope was still moving, consequently he was doing the same. This argued that he had not found the road yet, but was marching to it with some peasant. There was nothing for us to do but plod along, and this we did. At the end of 3 hours we were still plodding. This was not only mysterious, but exasperating, and very fatiguing, too, for we had tried hard along at first to catch up with the guide, but had only fagged ourselves in vain. For although he was traveling slowly, he was yet able to go faster than the hampered caravan over such ground. At 3 in the afternoon we were nearly dead with exhaustion, and still the rope was slowly gliding out. The murmurs against the guide had been growing steadily, and at last they were become loud and savage. A mutiny ensued. The men refused to proceed. They declared that we had been traveling over and over the same ground all day, in a kind of circle. They demanded that our end of the rope be made fast to a tree, so as to halt the guide until we could overtake him and kill him. This was not an unreasonable requirement, so I gave the order. As soon as the rope was tied, the expedition moved forward with that alacrity which the thirst for vengeance usually inspires. But after a tiresome march of almost half a mile, we came to a hill covered thick with a crumbly rubbish of stones, and so steep that no man of us all was now in a condition to climb it. Every attempt failed, and ended in crippling somebody. Within 20 minutes I had 5 men on crutches. Whenever a climber tried to assist himself by the rope, it yielded and let him tumble backward. The frequency of this result suggested an idea to me. I ordered the caravan to bout face and form in marching order. I then made the tow rope fast to the rear mule, and gave the command, "Mark time, by the right flank, forward, march!" The procession began to move, to the impressive strains of a battle chant, and I said to myself, "Now, if the rope don't break, I judge this will fetch that guide into the camp." I watched the rope gliding down the hill, and presently, when I was all fixed for triumph, I was confronted by a bitter disappointment. There was no guide tied to the rope. It was only a very indignant old black ram. The fury of the baffled expedition exceeded all bounds. They even wanted to wreak their unreasoning vengeance on this innocent dumb brute. But I stood between them and their prey, menaced by a bristling wall of ice-axes and alpenstocks, and proclaimed that there was but one road to this murder, and it was directly over my corpse. Even as I spoke, I saw that my doom was sealed, except a miracle supervened to divert these madmen from their fell purpose. I see the sickening wall of weapons now. I see that advancing host as I saw it then. I see the hate in those cruel eyes. I remember how I drooped my head upon my breast. I feel again the sudden earthquake shock in my rear, administered by the very ram I was sacrificing myself to save. I hear once more the typhoon of laughter that burst from the assaulting column as I clove it from van to rear like a sepoy shot from a Rodman gun. I was saved, yes, I was saved, and by the merciful instinct of ingratitude which nature had planted in the breast of that treacherous beast. The grace which eloquence had failed to work in those men's hearts had been wrought by a laugh. The ram was set free, and my life was spared. We lived to find out that the guide had deserted us as soon as he had placed a half a mile between himself and us. To avert suspicion, he had judged it best that the line should continue to move. So he caught that ram, and at the time that he was sitting on it, making the rope fast to it, we were imagining that he was lying in a swoon, overcome by fatigue and distress. When he allowed the ram to get up, it fell to plunging around, trying to rid itself of the rope, and this was the signal which we had risen up with glad shouts to obey. We had followed this ram round and round in a circle all day, a thing which was proven by the discovery that we had watered the expedition 7 times at one and the same spring in 7 hours. As expert a woodman as I am, I had somehow failed to notice this until my attention was called to it by a hog. This hog was always wallowing there, and as he was the only hog we saw, his frequent repetition, together with his unvarying similarity to himself, finally caused me to reflect that he must be the same hog, and this led me to the deduction that this must be the same spring also, which, indeed, it was. I made a note of this curious thing, as showing in a striking manner the relative difference between glacial action and the action of the hog. It is now a well-established fact that glaciers move. I consider that my observations go to show with equal conclusiveness that a hog in a spring does not move. I shall be glad to receive the opinions of other observers upon this point. To return, for an explanatory moment, to that guide, and then I shall be done with him. After leaving the ram tied to the rope, he had wandered at large a while, and then happened to run across a cow. Judging that a cow would naturally know more than a guide, he took her by the tail, and the result justified his judgment. She nibbled her leisurely way downhill till it was near milking time, then she struck for home and towed him into Zermatt. End of chapter 37. This is chapter 38 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain. Chapter 38. I Conquer a Gornergrat. We went into camp on that wild spot to which that ram had brought us. The men were greatly fatigued. Their conviction that we were lost was forgotten in the cheer of a good supper, and before the reaction had a chance to set in, I loaded them up with paregoric and put them to bed. Next morning I was considering in my mind our desperate situation and trying to think of a remedy, when Harris came to me with a Baedeker map, which showed conclusively that the mountain we were on was still in Switzerland. Yes, every part of it was in Switzerland, so we were not lost after all. This was an immense relief. It lifted the weight of 2 such mountains from my breast. I immediately had the news disseminated, and the map was exhibited. The effect was wonderful. As soon as the men saw with their own eyes that they knew where they were, and that it was only the summit that was lost and not themselves, they cheered up instantly, and said with one accord, "Let the summit take care of itself." Our distresses being at an end, I now determined to rest the men in camp and give the scientific department of the expedition a chance. First I made a barometric observation to get our altitude, but I could not perceive that there was any result. I knew by my scientific reading that either thermometers or barometers ought to be boiled to make them accurate. I did not know which it was, so I boiled them both. There was still no result. So I examined these instruments and discovered that they possessed radical blemishes. The barometer had no hand but the brass pointer, and the ball of the thermometer was stuffed with tin-foil. I might have boiled those things to rags and never found out anything. I hunted up another barometer. It was new and perfect. I boiled it half an hour in a pot of bean soup which the cooks were making. The result was unexpected. The instrument was not affecting at all. But there was such a strong barometer taste to the soup that the head cook, who was a most conscientious person, changed its name in the bill of fare. The dish was so greatly liked by all that I ordered the cook to have barometer soup every day. It was believed that the barometer might eventually be injured, but I did not care for that. I had demonstrated to my satisfaction that it could not tell how high a mountain was, therefore I had no real use for it. Changes in the weather I could take care of without it. I did not wish to know when the weather was going to be good. What I wanted to know was when it was going to be bad, and this I could find out from Harris's corns. Harris had had his corns tested and regulated at the Government Observatory in Heidelberg, and one could depend upon them with confidence. So I transferred the new barometer to the cooking department to be used for the official mess. It was found that even a pretty fair article of soup could be made from the defective barometer, so I allowed that one to be transferred to the subordinate mess. I next boiled the thermometer, and got a most excellent result. The mercury went up to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. In the opinion of the other scientists of the expedition, this seemed to indicate that we had attained the extraordinary altitude of 200,000 feet above sea level. Science places the line of eternal snow at about 10,000 feet above sea level. There was no snow where we were, consequently it was proven that the eternal snow line ceases somewhere above the 10,000-foot level and does not begin any more. This was an interesting fact, and one which had not been observed by any observer before. It was as valuable as interesting, too, since it would open up the deserted summits of the highest Alps to population and agriculture. It was a proud thing to be where we were, yet it caused us a pang to reflect that, but for that ram, we might just as well have been 200,000 feet higher. The success of my last experiment induced me to try an experiment with my photographic apparatus. I got it out and boiled one of my cameras, but the thing was a failure. It made the wood swell up and burst, and I could not see that the lenses were any better than they were before. I now concluded to boil a guide. It might improve him. It could not impair his usefulness. But I was not allowed to proceed. Guides have no feeling for science, and this one would not consent to be made uncomfortable in its interest. In the midst of my scientific work, one of those needless accidents happened which are always occurring among the ignorant and thoughtless. A porter shot at a chamois and missed it and crippled the Latinist. This was not a serious matter to me, for a Latinist's duties are as well performed on crutches as otherwise, but the fact remained that if the Latinist had not happened to be in the way, a mule would have got that load. That would have been quite another matter, for when it comes down to a question of value, there is a palpable difference between a Latinist and a mule. I could not depend on having a Latinist in the right place every time, so, to make things safe, I ordered that in the future the chamois must not be hunted within limits of the camp with any other weapon than the forefinger. My nerves had hardly grown quiet after this affair when they got another shake-up, one which utterly unmanned me for a moment. A rumor swept suddenly through the camp that one of the barkeepers had fallen over a precipice. However, it turned out that it was only a chaplain. I had laid in an extra force of chaplains, purposely to be prepared for emergencies like this, but by some unaccountable oversight had come away rather short-handed in the matter of barkeepers. On the following morning we moved on, well refreshed and in good spirits. I remember this day with peculiar pleasure, because it saw our road restored to us. Yes, we found our road again, and in quite an extraordinary way. We had plodded along some 2 hours and a half when we came up against a solid mass of rock about 20 feet high. I did not need to be instructed by a mule this time. I was already beginning to know more than any mule in the expedition. I at once put in a blast of dynamite and lifted that rock out of the way. But to my surprise and mortification, I found that there had been a chalet on top of it. I picked up such members of the family as fell in my vicinity, and subordinates of my corps collected the rest. None of these poor people were injured, happily, but they were much annoyed. I explained to the head chaleteer just how the thing happened, and that I was only searching for the road, and would certainly have given him timely notice if I had known he was up there. I said I had meant no harm, and hoped I had not lowered myself in his estimation by raising him a few rods in the air. I said many other judicious things, and finally, when I offered to rebuild his chalet and pay for the breakages and throw in the cellar, he was mollified and satisfied. He hadn't any cellar at all, before. He would not have as good a view now as formerly, but what he had lost in view he had gained in cellar by exact measurement. He said there wasn't another hole like that in the mountains. And he would have been right if the late mule had not tried to eat up the nitroglycerin. I put 116 men at work, and they rebuilt the chalet from its own debris in 15 minutes. It was a good deal more picturesque than it was before, too. The man said we were now on the Feierstutz, above the Schwegmatt, information which I was glad to get, since it gave us our position to a degree of particularity which we had not been accustomed to for a day or so. We also learned that we were standing at the foot of the Riffelberg proper, and that the initial chapter of our work was completed. We had a fine view from here of the energetic Visp, as it makes its first plunge into the world from under a huge arch of solid ice worn through the footwall of the great Gorner Glacier, and we could also see the Furgenbach, which is the outlet of the Furgen Glacier. The mule road to the summit of the Riffelberg passed right in front of the chalet, a circumstance which we almost immediately noticed, because a procession of tourists was filing along it pretty much all the time. Footnote 1. Pretty much may not be elegant English, but it is high time it was. There is no elegant word or phrase which means just what it means. M.T. End of footnote. The chaletier's business consisted in furnishing refreshments to tourists. My blast had interrupted this trade for a few minutes by breaking all the bottles on the place, but I gave the man a lot of whiskey to sell for Alpine champagne, and a lot of vinegar which would answer for Rhine wine. Consequently, trade was soon as brisk as ever. Leaving the expedition outside to rest, I quartered myself in the chalet with Harris, proposing to correct my journals and scientific observations before continuing the ascent. I had hardly begun my work when a tall, slender, vigorous American youth of about 23, who was on his way down the mountain, entered and came toward me with that breezy self-complacency which is the adolescent's idea of the well-bred ease of the man of the world. His hair was short and parted accurately in the middle, and he had all the look of an American person who would be likely to begin his signature with an initial, and spell his middle name out. He introduced himself, smiling a smirky smile borrowed from the courtiers of the stage, extended a fair-skinned talon, and while he gripped my hand in it, he bent his body forward 3 times at the hips, as the stage courtier does, and said in the airiest and most condescending and patronizing way, I quite remember his exact language, "Very glad to make your acquaintance, monsieur. Very glad indeed, assure you. I've read all your little efforts and greatly admired them, and when I heard you were here, I indicated a chair, and he sat down. This grandee was the grandson of an American of considerable note in his day, and not wholly forgotten yet, a man who came so near being a great man that he was quite generally accounted one while he lived. I slowly paced the floor, pondering scientific problems, and heard this conversation. Grandson. First to visit Europe? Harris. Mine? Yes. G.S. with a soft reminiscent sigh suggestive of bygone joys that may be tasted in their freshness but once. Ah, I know what it is to you. A first visit. Ah, the romance of it. I wish I could feel it again. H. Yes, I find it exceeds all my dreams. It is enchantment. I go— G.S. with a dainty gesture of the hand signifying, spare me your callow enthusiasms, good friend. Yes, I know. You go to the cathedrals and exclaim, and you drag through league-long picture galleries and exclaim, and you stand here and there and yonder upon historic ground and continue to exclaim, and you are permeated with your first crude conceptions of art, and are proud and happy. Ah, yes, proud and happy, that expresses it. Yes, enjoy it. It is right. It is an innocent revel. H. And you? Don't you do these things now? G.S. I? Oh, that is very good. My dear sir, when you are as old a traveler as I am, you will not ask such a question as that. I visit the regulation gallery, moon around the regulation cathedral, do the worn round of the regulation sites yet? Excuse me. H. Well, what do you do, then? G.S. Do? Well, I flit, and flit, for I am ever on the wing, but I avoid the herd. Today I'm in Paris, tomorrow in Berlin, anon in Rome. But you would look for me in vain in the galleries of the Louvre or the common resorts of the gazers in those other capitals. If you would find me, you must look in the unvisited nooks and corners where others never think of going. One day you will find me making myself at home in some obscure peasant's cabin. Another day you will find me in some forgotten castle, worshipping some little gem or art which the careless eye has overlooked and which the unexperienced would despise. Again, you will find me as guest in the inner sanctuaries of palaces while the herd is content to get a hurried glimpse of the unused chambers by feeing a servant. H. You are a guest in such places? G.S. And a welcoming one. H. It is surprising. How does it come? G.S. My grandfather's name is a passport to all the courts in Europe. I have only to utter that name, and every door is open to me. I flit from court to court at my own free will and pleasure, and am always welcome. I am as much at home in the palaces of Europe as you are among your relatives. I know every titled person in Europe, I think. I have my pockets full of invitations all the time. I am under promise to go to Italy, where I am to be the guest of a succession of the noblest houses in the land. In Berlin my life is a continued round of gaiety in the imperial palace. It is the same wherever I go. H. It must be very pleasant, but it must make Boston seem a little slow when you are at home. G.S. Yes, of course it does. But I don't go home much. There's no life there, little to feed a man's higher nature. Boston's very narrow, you know. She doesn't know it, and you couldn't convince her of it. So I say nothing when I'm there. Where's the use? Yes, Boston is very narrow, but she has such a good opinion of herself that she can't see it. A man who has traveled as much as I have, and seen as much of the world, sees it plain enough, but he can't cure it, you know, so the best is to leave it and seek a sphere which is more in harmony with his tastes and culture. I run across there once a year, perhaps, when I have nothing important on hand, but I'm very soon back again. I spend my time in Europe. H. I see. You map out your plans and— G.S. No, excuse me. I don't map out any plans. I simply follow the inclination of the day. I am limited by no ties, no requirements. I am not bound in any way. I am too old a traveler to hamper myself with deliberate purposes. I am simply a traveler, an inveterate traveler, a man of the world, in a word. I can call myself by no other name. I do not say, I am going here, or I am going there. I say nothing at all. I only act. For instance, next week you may find me the guest of a grandee of Spain, or you may find me off for Venice, or flitting toward Dresden. I shall probably go to Egypt presently. Friends will say to friends, "He is at the Nile cataracts," and at that very moment they will be surprised to learn that I'm away off yonder in India somewhere. I am a constant surprise to people. They are always saying, "Yes, he was in Jerusalem when we heard of him last, but goodness knows where he is now." Presently the grandson rose to leave, discovered he had an appointment with some emperor, perhaps. He did his graces over again, gripped me with one talon at arm's length, pressed his hat against his stomach with the other, bent his body in the middle 3 times, murmuring, "Pleasure, I'm sure, a great pleasure, I'm sure. Wish you much success." Then he removed his gracious presence. It is a great and solemn thing to have a grandfather. I have not purported to misrepresent this boy in any way, for what little indignation he excited in me soon passed and left nothing behind it but compassion. One cannot keep up a grudge against a vacuum. I have tried to repeat this lad's very words. If I have failed anywhere, I have at least not failed to reproduce the marrow and meaning of what he said. He and the innocent chatterbox whom I met on the Swiss lake are the most unique and interesting specimens of young America I came across during my foreign tramping. I have made honest portraits of them, not caricatures. The grandson of 23 referred to himself 5 or 6 times as an old traveler, and as many as 3 times, with a serene complacency which was maddening, as a man of the world. There was something very delicious about his leaving Boston to her narrowness, unreproved and uninstructed. I formed the caravan in marching order, presently, and after riding down the line to see that it was properly roped together, gave the command to proceed. In a little while the road carried us to open grassy land. We were above the troublesome forest now, and had an uninterrupted view straight before us of our summit, the summit of the Riffelberg. We followed the mule road, a zigzag course, now to the right, now to the left, but always up, and always crowded and incommoded by going and coming files of reckless tourists who were never in a single instance tied together. I was obliged to exert the utmost care and caution, for in many places the road was not 2 yards wide, and often the lower side of it sloped away in slanting precipices 8 and even 9 feet deep. I had to encourage the men constantly, to keep them from giving way to their unmanly fears. We might have made the summit before night, but for a delay caused by the loss of an umbrella. I was allowing the umbrella to remain lost, but the men murmured, and with reason, for in this exposed region we stood in peculiar need of protection against avalanches, so I went into camp and detached a strong party to go after the missing article. The difficulties of the next morning were severe, but our courage was high, for our goal was near. At noon we conquered the last impediment. We stood at last upon the summit, and without the loss of a single man except the mule that ate the glycerine. Our great achievement was achieved, the possibility of the impossible was demonstrated, and Harris and I walked proudly into the great dining-room of the Riffelberg Hotel and stood our alpenstocks up in the corner. Yes, I had made the grand ascent. But it was a mistake to do it in evening dress. The plug hats were battered, the swallow-tails were fluttering rags, mud added no grace. The general effect was unpleasant and even disreputable. There were about 75 tourists at the hotel, mainly ladies and little children, and they gave us an admiring welcome which paid us for all our privations and sufferings. The ascent had been made, and the names and dates now stand recorded on a stone monument there to prove it to all future tourists. I boiled a thermometer and took an altitude, with a most curious result. The summit was not as high as the point on the mountainside where I had taken the first altitude. Suspecting that I had made an important discovery, I prepared to verify it. There happened to be a still higher summit, called the Gornergrat, above the hotel, and notwithstanding the fact that it overlooks a glacier from a dizzy height, and that the ascent is difficult and dangerous, I resolved to venture up there and boil a thermometer. So I sent a strong party, with some borrowed hose, in charge of 2 chiefs of service, to dig a stairway in the soil all the way up, and this I ascended, roped to the guides. This breezy height was the summit proper, so I accomplished even more than I had originally proposed to do. This foolhardy exploit is recorded on another stone monument. I boiled my thermometer, and sure enough this spot, which purported to be 2,000 feet higher than the locality of the hotel, turned out to be 9,000 feet lower. Thus the fact was clearly demonstrated that above a certain point, the higher a point seems to be, the lower it actually is. Our ascent itself was a great achievement, but this contribution to science was an inconceivably greater matter. Cavillers object that water boils at a lower and lower temperature the higher and higher you go, and hence the apparent anomaly. I answer that I do not base my theory upon what the boiling water does, but upon what a boiled thermometer says. You can't go behind the thermometer. I had a magnificent view of Monte Rosa, and apparently all the rest of the Alpine world, from that high place. All the circling horizon was piled high with a mighty tumult of snowy crests. One might have imagined he saw before him the tented camps of a beleaguering host of Brobdingnagians. But, lonely, conspicuous, and superb, rose that wonderful upright wedge, the Matterhorn. Its precipitous sides were powdered over with snow, and the upper half hidden in thick clouds which now and then dissolved to cobweb films, and gave brief glimpses of the imposing tower as through a veil. Footnote number 2. Note: I had the very unusual luck to catch one little momentary glimpse of the Matterhorn wholly unencumbered by clouds. I leveled my photographic apparatus at it without the loss of an instant, and should have got an elegant picture if my donkey had not interfered. It was my purpose to draw this photograph all by myself for my book, but was obliged to put the mountain part of it into the hands of the professional artist, because I found I could not do landscape well. End of footnote 2. A little later the Matterhorn took to himself the semblance of a volcano. He was stripped naked to his apex around this circled vast wreaths of white cloud which strung slowly out and streamed away slantwise toward the sun, a 20-mile stretch of rolling and tumbling vapor, and looking just as if it were pouring out of a crater. Later again, one of the mountain's sides was clean and clear, and another side densely clothed from base to summit in thick smoke-like cloud, which feathered off and flew around the shaft's sharp edge like the smoke around the corners of a burning building. The Matterhorn is always experimenting, and always gets up fine effects, too. In the sunset, when all the lower world is palled in gloom, it points toward heaven out of the pervading blackness like a finger of fire. In the sunrise, well, they say it is very fine in the sunrise. Authorities agree that there is no such tremendous layout of snowy alpine magnitude, grandeur, and sublimity to be seen from any other accessible point as the tourist may see from the summit of the Riffelberg. Therefore, let the tourist rope himself up and go there, for I have shown that with nerve, caution, and judgment the thing can be done. I wish to add one remark here, in parentheses, so to speak, suggested by the word snowy, which I have just used. We have all seen hills and mountains and levels with snow on them, and so we think we know all the aspects and effects produced by snow. But, indeed, we do not until we have seen the Alps. Possibly mass and distance add something, at any rate something is added. Among other noticeable things, there is a dazzling intense whiteness about the distant alpine snow when the sun is on it, which one recognizes as peculiar, and not familiar to the eye. The snow which one is accustomed to has a tint to it. Painters usually give it a bluish cast, but there is no perceptible tint to the distant alpine snow when it is trying to look its whitest. As to the unimaginable splendor of it when the sun is blazing down on it, well, it simply is unimaginable. End of chapter 38. This is chapter 39 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, chapter 39, We Travel by Glacier. A guidebook is a queer thing. The reader has just seen what a man who undertakes the great ascent from Zermatt to the Riffelberg Hotel must experience. Yet Baedeker makes these strange statements concerning this matter. 1. Distance, 3 hours. 2. The road cannot be mistaken. 3. Guide unnecessary. 4. Distance from Riffelberg Hotel to Gornergrat, 1 hour and a half. 5. Ascent simple and easy, guide unnecessary. 6. Elevation of Zermatt above sea level, 5,315 feet. 7. Elevation of Riffelberg Hotel above sea level, 8,429 feet. 8. Elevation of the Gornergrat above sea level, 10,289 feet. I have pretty effectually throttled these errors by sending him the following demonstrated facts. 1. Distance from Zermatt to Riffelberg Hotel, 7 days. 2. The road can be mistaken. If I am the first that did it, I want the credit of it too. 3. Guides are necessary, for none but a native can read those finger-boards. 4. The estimate of the elevation of the several localities above sea level is pretty correct for Baedeker. He only misses it about 180 or 90,000 feet. I found my arnica invaluable. My men were suffering excruciatingly from the friction of sitting down so much. During 2 or 3 days not one of them was able to do more than lie down or walk about, yet so effective was the arnica that on the 4th all were able to sit up. I consider that, more than to anything else, I owe the success of our great undertaking to arnica and paregoric. My men are being restored to health and strength. My main perplexity now was how to get them down the mountain again. I was not willing to expose the brave fellows to the perils, fatigues, and hardships of that fearful route again, if it could be helped. First I thought of balloons, but of course I had to give that idea up, for balloons were not procurable. I thought of several other expedients, but upon consideration discarded them for cause. But at last I hit it. I was aware that the movement of glaciers is an established fact, for I had read it in Baedeker. So I resolved to take passage for Zermatt on the great Gorner Glacier. Very good. The next thing was, how to get down the glacier comfortably, for the mule road to it was long and winding and wearisome. I set my mind at work, and soon thought out a plan. One looks straight down upon the vast frozen river called the Gorner Glacier from the Gorner Grat, a sheer precipice 1,200 feet high. We had 154 umbrellas, and what is an umbrella but a parachute? I mentioned this noble idea to Harris with enthusiasm, and was about to order the expedition to form on the Gorner Grat with their umbrellas, and prepare for flight by platoons, each platoon in command of a guide, when Harris stopped me and urged me not to be too hasty. He asked me if this method of descending the Alps had ever been tried before. I said no, I had not heard of an instance. Then, in his opinion, it was a matter of considerable gravity. In his opinion, it would not be well to send the whole command over the cliff at once. A better way would be to send down a single individual first and see how he fared. I saw the wisdom in this idea instantly. I said as much, and thanked my agent cordially, and told him to take his umbrella and try the thing right away, and wave his hat when he got down, if he struck in a soft place, and then I would ship the rest right along. Harris was greatly touched with this mark of confidence, and said so, in a voice that had a perceptible tremble in it. But at the same time he said he did not feel himself worthy of so conspicuous a favor, that it might cause jealousy in the command, for there were plenty who would not hesitate to say he had used underhanded means to get the appointment, whereas his conscience would bear him witness that he had not sought it at all, nor even in his secret heart desired it. I said these words did him extreme credit, but that he must not throw away the imperishable distinction of being the first man to descend an Alp per parachute simply to save the feelings of some envious underlings. No, I said, he must accept the appointment. It was no longer an invitation, it was a command. He thanked me with effusion, and said that putting the thing in this form removed every objection. He retired, and soon returned with his umbrella, his eye flaming with gratitude and his cheeks pallid with joy. Just then the head guide passed along. Harris's expression changed to one of infinite tenderness, and he said, "That man did me a cruel injury 4 days ago, and I said in my heart he should live to perceive and confess that the only noble revenge a man can take upon his enemy is to return good for evil. I resign in his favor. Appoint him." I threw my arms around the generous fellow, and said, "Harris, you are the noblest soul that lives. You shall not regret this sublime act, neither shall the world fail to know of it. You shall have opportunity far transcending this one, too, if I live. Remember that." I called the head guide to me and appointed him on the spot, but the thing aroused no enthusiasm in him. He did not take to the idea at all. He said, "Tie myself to an umbrella and jump over the Gorner Grat. Excuse me, there are a great many pleasanter roads to the devil than that." Upon a discussion of the subject with him, it appeared that he considered the project distinctly and decidedly dangerous. I was not convinced, yet I was not willing to try the experiment in any risky way, that is, in a way that might cripple the strength and efficiency of the expedition. I was about at my wits' end when it occurred to me to try it on the Latinist. He was called in, but he declined, on the plea of inexperience, diffidence in public, lack of curiosity, and I didn't know what all. Another man declined on account of a cold in the head, thought he ought to avoid exposure. Another could not jump well, never could jump well, did not believe he could jump so far without long and patient practice. Another was afraid it was going to rain, and his umbrella had a hole in it. Everybody had an excuse. The result was what the reader has by this time guessed: the most magnificent idea that was ever conceived had to be abandoned, from sheer lack of a person with enterprise enough to carry it out. Yes, I actually had to give that thing up, while doubtless I should live to see somebody use it and take all the credit from me. Well, I had to go overland. There was no other way. I marched the expedition down the steep and tedious mule path and took up as good a position as I could upon the middle of the glacier, because Baedeker said the middle part travels the fastest. As a measure of economy, however, I put some of the heavier baggage on the shoreward parts, to go as slow freight. I waited and waited, but the glacier did not move. Night was coming on. The darkness began to gather. Still, we did not budge. It occurred to me then that there might be a timetable in Baedeker. It would be well to find out the hours of starting. I called for the book. It could not be found. Bradshaw would certainly contain a timetable, but no Bradshaw could be found. Very well, I must make the best of the situation. So I pitched the tents, picketed the animals, milked the cows, had supper, paregoricked the men, established the watch, and went to bed, with orders to call me as soon as we came in sight of Zermatt. I woke about 10:30 next morning and looked around. We hadn't budged a peg. At first I could not understand it. Then it occurred to me that the old thing must be aground. So I cut down some trees and rigged a spar on the starboard and another on the port side, and fooled away upward of 3 hours trying to spar her off. But it was of no use. She was half a mile wide and 15 or 20 miles long, and there was no telling just whereabouts she was aground. The men began to show uneasiness, too, and presently they came flying to me with ashy faces, saying she had sprung a leak. Nothing but my cool behavior at this critical time saved us from another panic. I ordered them to show me the place. They led me to a spot where a huge boulder lay in a deep pool of clear and brilliant water. It did look like a pretty bad leak, but I kept that to myself. I made a pump and set the men to work to pump out the glacier. We made a success of it. I perceived then that it was not a leak at all. This boulder had descended from a precipice and stopped on the ice in the middle of the glacier, and the sun had warmed it up every day, and consequently it had melted its way deeper and deeper into the ice, until at last it reposed, as we had found it, in a deep pool of the clearest and coldest water. Presently Baedeker was found again, and I hunted eagerly for the timetable. There was none. The book simply said the glacier was moving all the time. This was satisfactory, so I shut up the book and chose a good position to view the scenery as we passed along. I stood there some time enjoying the trip, but at last it occurred to me that we did not seem to be gaining any on the scenery. I said to myself, "This confounded old thing's aground again sure," and opened Baedeker to see if I could run across any remedy for these annoying interruptions. I soon found a sentence which threw a dazzling light upon the matter. It said, "The Gorner Glacier travels at an average rate of a little less than an inch a day." I have seldom felt so outraged. I have seldom had my confidence so wantonly betrayed. I made a small calculation. 1 inch a day, say 30 feet a year. Estimated distance to Zermatt, 3 1/18 miles. Time required to go by glacier, a little over 500 years. I said to myself, I can walk it quicker, and before I will patronize such a fraud as this, I will do it. When I revealed to Harris the fact that the passenger part of this glacier, the central part, the lightning express part, so to speak, was not due in Zermatt till the summer of 2378, and that the baggage, coming along the slow edge, would not arrive until some generations later, he burst out with, "That is European management all over. An inch a day, think of that! 500 years to go a trifle over 3 miles. But I am not a bit surprised. It's a Catholic glacier. You can tell by the look of it, and the management." I said no, I believed nothing but the extreme end of it was in a Catholic canton. "Well, then, it's a government glacier," said Harris. "It's all the same. Over here the government runs everything, so everything's slow. Slow and ill-managed. But with us everything's done by private enterprise, and then there ain't much lolling around, so you can depend on it. I wish Tom Scott could get his hands on this torpid old slab once. You'd see it take a different gait from this." I said I was sure he would increase the speed, if there was trade enough to justify it. "He'd make trade," said Harris. "That's the difference between governments and individuals. Governments don't care, individuals do. Tom Scott would take all the trade. In 2 years Gorner's stock would go to 200, and inside of 2 more you would see all the other glaciers under the hammer for taxes." After a reflective pause, Harris added, "A little less than an inch a day. A little less than an inch, mind you. Well, I'm losing my reverence for glaciers." I was feeling much the same way myself. I have traveled by canal boat, ox wagon, raft, and by the Ephesus and Smyrna railway, but when it comes down to good old solid honest slow motion, I bet my money on the glacier. As a means of passenger transportation I consider the glacier a failure, but as a vehicle of slow freight I think she fills the bill. In the matter of putting the fine shades on that line of business, I judge she could teach the Germans something. I ordered the men to break camp and prepare for the land journey to Zermatt. At this moment a most interesting find was made. A dark object, bedded in the glacial ice, was cut out with the ice-axes, and it proved to be a piece of the undressed skin of some animal, a hair-trunk perhaps. But a close inspection disabled the hair-trunk theory, and further discussion and examination exploded it entirely. That is, in the opinion of all the scientists except the one who had advanced it. This one clung to his theory with affectionate fidelity characteristic of originators of scientific theories, and afterward won many of the first scientists of the age to his view by a very able pamphlet which he wrote, entitled "Evidences going to show that the hair-trunk, in a wild state, belonged to the early glacial period, and roamed the wastes of chaos in the company with the cave-bear, primeval man, and the other oolitics of the old Silurian family." Each of our scientists had a theory of his own, and put forward an animal of his own as a candidate for the skin. I sided with the geologist of the expedition, in the belief that this patch of skin had once helped to cover a Siberian elephant in some old forgotten age, but we divided there, the geologist believing that this discovery proved that Siberia had formerly been located where Switzerland is now, whereas I held the opinion that it merely proved that the primeval Swiss was not the dull savage he is represented to have been, but was a being of high intellectual development who liked to go to the menagerie. We arrived that evening, after many hardships and adventures, in some fields close to the great ice arch, where the mad Visp boils and surges out from under the foot of the great Gorner Glacier, and here we camped, our perils over and our magnificent undertaking successfully completed. We marched into Zermatt the next day, and were received with the most lavish honors and applause. A document signed and sealed by the authorities was given to me, which established and endorsed the fact that I had made the ascent of the Riffelberg. This I wear around my neck, and it will be buried with me when I am no more. End of chapter 39. This is chapter 40 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, chapter 40. Piteous Relics at Chamonix. I am not so ignorant about glacial movement now as I was when I took passage on the Gorner Glacier. I have read up since. I am aware that these vast bodies of ice do not travel at the same rate of speed. While the Gorner Glacier makes less than an inch a day, the Unter Aar Glacier makes as much as 8, and still other glaciers are said to go 12, 16, and even 20 inches a day. One writer says that the slowest glacier travels 25 feet a year, and the fastest 400. What is a glacier? It is easy to say it looks like a frozen river which occupies the bed of a winding gorge or gully between mountains, but that gives no notion of its vastness, for it is sometimes 600 feet thick, and we are not accustomed to rivers 600 feet deep. No, our rivers are 6 feet, 20 feet, and sometimes 50 feet deep. We are not quite able to grasp so large a fact as an ice river 600 feet deep. The glacier's surface is not smooth and level, but has deep swales and swelling elevations, and sometimes has the look of a tossing sea whose turbulent billows were frozen hard in the instant of their most violent motion. The glacier's surface is not a flawless mass, but is a river with cracks or crevices, some narrow, some gaping wide. Many a man, the victim of a slip or a misstep, has plunged down one of these and met his death. Men have been fished out of them alive, but it was when they did not go to a great depth. The cold of the great depths would quickly stupefy a man, whether he was hurt or unhurt. These cracks do not go straight down. One can seldom see more than 20 to 40 feet down them. Consequently, men who have disappeared in them have been sought for in the hope that they had stopped within helping distance, whereas their case, in most instances, had really been hopeless from the beginning. In 1864 a party of tourists was descending Mont Blanc, and while picking their way over one of the mighty glaciers of that lofty region, roped together as was proper, a young porter disengaged himself from the line and started across an ice bridge which spanned a crevice. It broke under him with a crash, and he disappeared. The others could not see how deep he had gone, so it might be worth while to try and rescue him. A brave young guide named Michel Payot volunteered. 2 ropes were made fast to his leather belt, and he bore the end of the third one in his hand, to tie to the victim in case he found him. He was lowered into the crevice, he descended deeper and deeper between the clear blue walls of solid ice, he approached a bend in the crack and disappeared under it. Down and still down he went, into this profound grave. When he had reached a depth of 80 feet, he passed under another bend in the crack, and thence descended 80 feet lower, as between perpendicular precipices. Arrived at this stage of 160 feet below the surface of the glacier, he peered through the twilight dimness and perceived that the chasm took another turn and stretched away at a steep slant to unknown deeps, for its course was lost in darkness. What a place that was to be in, especially if that leather belt should break! The compression of the belt threatened to suffocate the intrepid fellow. He called to his friends to draw him up, but could not make them hear. They still lowered him deeper and deeper. Then he jerked his third cord as vigorously as he could. His friends understood, and dragged him out of those icy jaws of death. Then they attached a bottle to a cord and sent it down 200 feet, but it found no bottom. It came up covered with congelations, evidence enough that even if the poor porter reached the bottom with unbroken bones, a swift death from cold was sure anyway. A glacier is a stupendous, ever-progressing, resistless plow. It pushes ahead of it masses of boulders which are packed together, and they stretch across the gorge, right in front of it, like a long grave or long, sharp roof. This is called a moraine. It also shoves out a moraine along each side of its course. Imposing as the modern glaciers are, they are not so huge as were some that once existed. For instance, Mr. Whymper says, "At some very remote period, the valley of Aosta was occupied by a vast glacier, which flowed down its entire length from Mont Blanc to the plain of Piedmont, remained stationary, or nearly so, at its mouth for many centuries, and deposited there enormous masses of debris. The length of this glacier exceeded 80 miles, and it drained a basin 25 to 35 miles across, bounded by the highest mountains in the Alps. The great peaks rose several thousand feet above the glaciers, and then, as now, shattered by sun and frost, poured down their showers of rocks and stones, in witness of which there are the immense piles of angular fragments that constitute the moraines of Ivrea. The moraines around Ivrea are of extraordinary dimensions. That which was on the left bank of the glacier is about 13 miles long, and in some places rises to a height of 2,130 feet above the floor of the valley. The terminal moraines, those which are pushed in front of the glaciers, cover something like 20 square miles of country. At the mouth of the valley of Aosta, the thickness of the glacier must have been at least 2,000 feet, and its width, at that part, 5 miles and a quarter. It is not easy to get at a comprehension of a mass of ice like that. If one could cleave off the butt end of such a glacier, an oblong block 2 or 3 miles wide by 5 and a quarter long and 2,000 feet thick, he could completely hide the city of New York under it, and Trinity Steeple would only stick up into it relatively as far as a shingle nail would stick up into the bottom of a Saratoga trunk. The boulders from Mont Blanc, upon the plain below Ivrea, assure us that the glacier which transported them existed for a prodigious length of time. Their present distance from the cliffs from which they were derived is about 420,000 feet, and if we assume that they traveled at the rate of 400 feet per annum, their journey must have occupied them no less than 1,055 years. In all probability, they did not travel so fast. Glaciers are sometimes hurried out of their characteristic snail pace. A marvelous spectacle is presented then. Mr. Whymper refers to a case which occurred in Iceland in 1721. It seems that in the neighborhood of the mountain Kotlugja, large bodies of water formed underneath or within the glaciers, either on account of the interior heat of the earth or from other causes, and at length acquired irresistible power, tore the glaciers from their mooring on the land, and swept them over every obstacle into the sea. Prodigious masses of ice were thus borne for a distance of about 10 miles over land in the space of a few hours, and their bulk was so enormous that they covered the sea for 7 miles from the shore, and remained aground in 600 feet of water. The denudation of the land was upon a grand scale. All superficial accumulations were swept away, and the bedrock was exposed. It was described in graphic language how all irregularities and depressions were obliterated, and a smooth surface of several miles' area laid bare, and that this area had the appearance of having been planed by a plane. The account translated from the Icelandic says that the mountain-like ruins of this majestic glacier so covered the sea that as far as the eye could reach no open water was discoverable, even from the highest peaks. A monster wall or barrier of ice was built across a considerable stretch of land, too, by this strange eruption. One can form some idea of the altitude of this barrier of ice when it is mentioned that from Hoftabreka Farm, which lies high up on a fjeld, one could not see Hjörleifshofti opposite, which is a fell 640 feet in height, but in order to do so had to clamber up a mountain slope east of Hoftabreka, 1,200 feet high. These things will help the reader to understand why it is that a man who keeps company with glaciers comes to feel tolerably insignificant by and by. The Alps and the glaciers together are able to take every bit of conceit out of a man and reduce his self-importance to zero, if he will only remain within the influence of their sublime presence long enough to give it a fair and reasonable chance to do its work. The Alpine glaciers move, that is granted now by everybody. But there was a time when people scoffed at the idea. They said you might as well expect leagues of solid rock to crawl along the ground as expect leagues of ice to do it. But proof after proof was furnished, and finally the world had to believe. The wise men not only said the glacier moved, but they timed its movement. They ciphered out a glacier's gait, and then said confidently that it would travel just so far in so many years. There is record of a striking and curious example of the accuracy which may be attained in these reckonings. In 1820, the ascent of Mont Blanc was attempted by a Russian and 2 Englishmen with 7 guides. They had reached a prodigious altitude, and were approaching the summit. when an avalanche swept several of the party down a sharp slope of 200 feet and hurled 5 of them, all guides, into one of the crevices of a glacier. The life of one of the 5 was saved by a long barometer which was strapped to his back. It bridged the crevice and suspended him until help came. The alpenstock or bâton of another saved its owner in a similar way. 3 men were lost, Pierre Balmat, Pierre Carrier, and Auguste Tairraz. They had been hurled down into the fathomless great deeps of the crevice. Dr. Forbes, an English geologist, had made frequent visits to the Mont Blanc region, and had given much attention to the disputed question of the movement of glaciers. During one of these visits he completed his estimates of the rate of movement of the glacier which had swallowed up the 3 guides, and uttered the prediction that the glacier would deliver up its dead at the foot of the mountain 35 years from the time of the accident, or possibly 40. A dull, slow journey, a movement imperceptible to any eye, but it was proceeding, nevertheless, and without cessation. It was a journey which a rolling stone would make in a few seconds. The lofty point of departure was visible from the village below in the valley. The prediction cut curiously close to the truth. 41 years after the catastrophe, the remains were cast forth at the foot of the glacier. I find an interesting account of the matter in the Histoire du Mont Blanc by Stephen Darve. I will condense this account as follows. On the 12th of August, 1861, at the hour of the close of Mass, a guide arrived out of breath at the mairie of Chamonix, and bearing on his shoulders a very lugubrious burden. It was a sack filled with human remains which he had gathered from the orifice of a crevice in the Glacier des Bossons. He conjectured that these were remains of the victims of the catastrophe of 1820, and a minute inquest, immediately instituted by the local authorities, soon demonstrated the correctness of his supposition. The contents of the sack were spread upon a long table and officially inventoried as follows: portions of 3 human skulls, several tufts of black and blond hair, a human jaw, furnished with fine white teeth, a forearm and hand, all the fingers of the latter intact. The flesh was white and fresh, and both the arm and hand preserved a degree of flexibility in the articulations. The ring finger had suffered a slight abrasion, and the stain of the blood was still visible and unchanged after 41 years. A left foot, the flesh white and fresh. Along with these fragments were portions of waistcoats, hats, hobnailed shoes, and other clothing, a wing of a pigeon, with black feathers, a fragment of an alpenstock, a tin lantern, and lastly a boiled leg of mutton, the only flesh among all the remains that exhaled an unpleasant odor. The guide said that the mutton had no odor when he took it from the glacier. An hour's exposure to the sun had already begun the work of decomposition upon it. Persons were called for, to identify these poor pathetic relics, and a touching scene ensued. 2 men were still living who had witnessed the grim catastrophe of nearly half a century before: Marie Couttet, saved by his bâton, and Julien Davoisseau, saved by the barometer. These aged men entered and approached the table. Davoisseau, more than 80 years old, contemplated the mournful remains mutely and with a vacant eye, for his intelligence and his memory were torpid with age. But Coutet's faculties were still perfect at 72, and he exhibited strong emotion. He said, "Pierre Balmat was fair. He wore a straw hat. This bit of skull, with the tuft of blond hair, was his. This is his hat. Pierre Carrier was very dark. This skull was his, and this felt hat. This is Balmat's hand. I remember it so well." And the old man bent down and kissed it reverently, then closed his fingers upon it in an affectionate grasp, crying out, "I could never have dared to believe that before quitting this world it would be granted me to press once more the hand of one of those brave comrades, the hand of my good friend Balmat." There is something weirdly pathetic about the picture of that white-haired veteran greeting with his loving handshake this friend who had been dead 40 years. When these hands met last, they were alike in the softness and freshness of youth. Now, one was brown and wrinkled and horny with age, while the other was still as young and fair and blemishless as if those 40 years had come and gone in a single moment, leaving no mark of their passage. Time had gone on in one case, it had stood still in the other. A man who has not seen a friend for a generation keeps him in mind always as he saw him last, and is somehow surprised, and is also shocked, to see the aging change the years have wrought when he sees him again. Marie Coutet's experience in finding his friend's hand unaltered from the image of it which he had carried in his memory for 40 years is an experience which stands alone in the history of man, perhaps. Coutet identified other relics. This hat belonged to Auguste Tairraz. He carried the cage of pigeons which we proposed to set free upon the summit. Here is the wing of one of those pigeons, and here is the fragment of my broken baton. It was by grace of that baton that my life was saved. Who could have told me that I should one day have the satisfaction to look again upon this bit of wood that supported me above the grave that swallowed up my unfortunate companions? No portions of the body of Tairraz, other than a piece of the skull, had been found. A diligent search was made, but without result. However, another search was instituted a year later, and this had better success. Many fragments of clothing which had belonged to the lost guides were discovered, also part of a lantern, and a green veil with blood-stains on it. But the interesting feature was this. One of the searchers came suddenly upon a sleeved arm projecting from a crevice in the ice wall, with the hand outstretched as if offering greeting. The nails of this white hand were still rosy, and the pose of the extended fingers seemed to express an eloquent welcome to the long-lost light of day. The hand and arm were alone. There was no trunk. After being removed from the ice, the flesh tints quickly faded out, and the rosy nails took on an alabaster hue of death. This was the third right hand found. Therefore all three of the lost men were accounted for, beyond cavil or question. Dr. Hamel was the Russian gentleman of the party which made the ascent at the time of the famous disaster. He left Chamonix as soon as he conveniently could after the descent, and as he had shown a chilly indifference about the calamity, and offered neither sympathy nor assistance to the widows and orphans, he carried with him the cordial execrations of the whole community. 4 months before the first remains were found, a Chamonix guide named Balmat, a relative of one of the lost men, was in London, and one day encountered a hale old gentleman in the British Museum who said, "I overheard your name. Are you from Chamonix, Monsieur Balmat?" "Yes, sir." "Haven't they found the bodies of my 3 guides yet? I am Dr. Hamel." "Alas, no, monsieur." "Well, you'll find them sooner or later." "Yes, it is the opinion of Dr. Forbes and Mr. Tyndall that the glacier will sooner or later restore to us the remains of the unfortunate victims." "Without a doubt, without a doubt. And it will be a great thing for Chamonix, in the matter of attracting tourists. You can get up a museum with those remains that will draw." This savage idea has not improved the odor of Dr. Hamel's name in Chamonix by any means. But, after all, the man was sound on human nature. His idea was conveyed to the public officials of Chamonix, and they gravely discussed it around the official council table. They were only prevented from carrying it into execution by the determined opposition of the friends and descendants of the lost guides, who insisted on giving the remains Christian burial, and succeeded in their purpose. A close watch had to be kept upon all the poor remnants and fragments to prevent embezzlement. A few accessory odds and ends were sold. Rags and scraps of the coarse clothing were parted with at the rate equal to about $20 a yard. A piece of a lantern and 1 or 2 other trifles brought nearly their weight in gold, and an Englishman offered £1 sterling for a single breeches button. End of chapter 40. This is chapter 41 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain. Chapter 41, The Fearful Disaster of 1865. One of the most memorable of all the Alpine catastrophes was that of July 1865 on the Matterhorn, already slightly referred to a few pages back. The details of it are scarcely known in America. To the vast majority of readers, they are not known at all. Mr. Whymper's account is the only authentic one. I will import the chief portion of it into this book, partly because of its intrinsic interest, and partly because it gives such a vivid idea of what the perilous pastime of Alp climbing is. This was Mr. Whymper's 9th attempt, during a series of years, to vanquish that steep and stubborn pillar or rock. It succeeded, the other 8 were failures. No man had ever accomplished the ascent before, though the attempts had been numerous. Mr. Whymper's narrative. We started from Zermatt on the 13th of July at 5:30 on a brilliant and perfectly cloudless morning. We were 8 in number: Cross, guide; old Peter Taugwalder, guide, and his 2 sons; Lord F. Douglas, Mr. Hadow, Reverend Mr. Hudson, and I. To ensure steady motion, 1 tourist and 1 native walked together. The youngest Taugwalder fell to my share. The wine-bags also fell to my lot to carry, and throughout the day, after each drink, I replenished them secretly with water, so that, at the next halt, they were found fuller than before. This was considered a good omen, and little short of miraculous. On the first day we did not intend to ascend to any great height, and we mounted, accordingly, very leisurely. Before 12 o'clock we had found a good position for the tent, at a height of 11,000 feet. We passed the remaining hours of daylight, some basking in the sunshine, some sketching, some collecting. Hudson made tea, I coffee, and at length we retired, each one to his blanket bag. We assembled together before dawn on the 14th, and started directly it was light enough to move. One of the young Taugwalders returned to Zermatt. In a few minutes we turned the rib, which had intercepted the view of the eastern face from our tent platform. The whole of this great slope was now revealed, rising for 3,000 feet like a huge natural staircase. Some parts were more, and others were less easy, but we were not once brought to a halt by any serious impediment, for when an obstruction was met in front, it could always be turned to the right or to the left. For the greater part of the way there was no occasion, indeed, for the rope, and sometimes Hudson led, sometimes myself. At 6:20 we had attained a height of 12,800 feet, and halted for half an hour. We then continued the ascent without a break until 9:55, when we stopped for 50 minutes, at a height of 14,000 feet. We had now arrived at the foot of that part which, seen from the Riffelberg, seems perpendicular or overhanging. We could no longer continue on the eastern side. For a little distance we ascended by snow upon the arête, that is, the ridge, then turned over to the right, or northern side. The work became difficult, and required caution. In some places there was little to hold. The general slope of the mountain was less than 40 degrees, and snow had accumulated in, and had filled up, the interstices of the rock face, leaving only occasional fragments projecting here and there. These were at times covered with a thin film of ice. It was a place which any fair mountaineer might pass in safety. We bore away nearly horizontally for about 400 feet, then ascended directly toward the summit for about 60 feet, then doubled back to the ridge which descends towards Zermatt. A long stride round a rather awkward corner brought us to snow once more. That last doubt vanished. The Matterhorn was ours. Nothing but 200 feet of easy snow remained to be surmounted. The higher we rose, the more intense became the excitement. The slope eased off. At length we could be detached, and Cross and I, dashed away, ran a neck-and-neck race, which ended in a dead heat. At 1:40 p.m. the world was at our feet, and the Matterhorn was conquered. The others arrived. Cross now took the tent-pole and planted it in the highest snow. "Yes," we said, "there is the flagstaff, but where is the flag?" "Here it is," he answered, pulling off his blouse and fixing it to the stick. It made a poor flag, and there was no wind to float it out, yet it was seen all around. They saw it at Zermatt, at the Riffel, in the Val Tournanche. We remained on the summit for 1 hour. One crowded hour of glorious life. It passed away too quickly, and we began to prepare for the descent. Hudson and I consulted as to the best and safest arrangement of the party. We agreed that it was best for Cross to go first and Hadow second. Hudson, who was almost equal to a guide in sureness of foot, wished to be third. Lord Douglas was placed next, and old Peter, the strongest of the remainder, after him. I suggested to Hudson that we should attach a rope to the rocks on our arrival at the difficult bit, and hold it as we descended as an additional protection. He approved the idea, but it was not definitely decided that it should be done. The party was being arranged in the above order while I was sketching the summit, and they had finished, and were waiting for me to be tied in line, when someone remembered that our names had not been left in the bottle. They requested me to write them down, and moved off while it was being done. A few minutes afterward I tied myself to young Peter, ran down after the others, and caught them just as they were commencing the descent of the difficult part. Great care was being taken. Only one man was moving at a time. When he was firmly planted, the next advanced, and so on. They had not, however, attached the additional rope to rocks, and nothing was said about it. The suggestion was not made for my own sake, and I am not sure that it ever occurred to me again. For some little distance we too followed the others, detached from them, and should have continued so had not Lord Douglas asked me about 3 p.m. to tie on to old Peter, as he feared, he said, that Taugwalder would not be able to hold his ground if a slip occurred. A few minutes later a sharp-eyed lad ran into the Monte Rosa Hotel at Zermatt, saying that he had seen an avalanche fall from the summit of the Matterhorn onto the Matterhorn glacier. The boy was reproved for telling idle stories. He was right, nevertheless, and this was what he saw. Michel Croz had laid aside his axe, and in order to give Mr. Hadow greater security, was absolutely taking hold of his legs, and putting his feet, one by one, into their proper positions. As far as I know, no one was actually descending. I cannot speak with certainty, because the two leading men were partially hidden from my sight by an intervening mass of rock, but it is my belief, from the movements of their shoulders, that Croz, having done as I said, was in the act of turning round to go down a step or two himself. At this moment Mr. Hadow slipped, fell against him, and knocked him over. I heard one startled exclamation from Croz, then saw him and Mr. Hadow flying downward. In another moment Hudson was dragged from his steps, and Lord Douglas immediately after him. All this was the work of a moment. Immediately we heard Croz's exclamation, old Peter and I planted ourselves as firmly as the rocks would permit. The rope was taut between us, and the jerk came on us both as on one man. We held, but the rope broke midway between Taugwalder and Lord Francis Douglas. For a few seconds we saw our unfortunate companions sliding downward on their backs, and spreading out their hands, endeavoring to save themselves. They passed from our sight uninjured, disappeared one by one, and fell from the precipice to precipice onto the Matterhorn glacier below, a distance of nearly 4,000 feet in height. From the moment the rope broke it was impossible to help them. So perished our comrades. For more than 2 hours afterward I thought almost every moment that the next would be my last, for the Taugwalders, utterly unnerved, were not only incapable of giving assistance, but were in such a state that a slip might have been expected from them at any moment. After a time we were able to do that which should have been done at first, and fixed rope to firm rocks, in addition to being tied together. These ropes were cut from time to time, and were left behind. Even with their assurance, the men were afraid to proceed, and several times old Peter turned, with ashy face and faltering limbs, and said, with terrible emphasis, "I cannot." About 6 p.m. we arrived at the snow upon the ridge descending toward Zermatt, and all peril was over. We frequently looked, but in vain, for traces of our unfortunate companions. We bent over the ridge and cried to them, but no sound returned. Convinced at last that they were neither within sight nor hearing, we ceased from our useless efforts, and, too cast down for speech, silently gathered up our things and the little effects of those who were lost, and then completed the descent. Such is Mr. Whymper's graphic and thrilling narrative. Zermatt gossip darkly hints that the elder Taugwalder cut the rope when the accident occurred, in order to preserve himself from being dragged into the abyss. But Mr. Whymper says that the ends of the rope showed no evidence of cutting, but only of breaking. He adds that if Taugwalder had had the disposition to cut the rope, he would not have had time to do it. The accident was so sudden and unexpected. Lord Douglas's body has never been found. It probably lodged upon some inaccessible shelf in the face of the mighty precipice. Lord Douglas was a youth of 19. The 3 other victims fell nearly 4,000 feet, and their bodies lay together upon the glacier when found by Mr. Whymper and the other searchers the next morning. Their graves are beside the little church in Zermatt. End of chapter 41. This is chapter 42 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, chapter 42. Chelan has a nice, roomy dungeon. Switzerland is simply a large, humpy, solid rock with a thin skin of grass stretched over it. Consequently, they do not dig graves, they blast them out with powder and fuse. They cannot afford to have large graveyards. The grass skin is too circumscribed and too valuable. It is all required for the support of the living. The graveyard in Zermatt occupies only about 1/8 of an acre. The graves are sunk in the living rock, and are very permanent. But occupation of them is only temporary. The occupant can only stay till his grave is needed by a later subject. He is removed then, for they do not bury one body on top of another. As I understand it, a family owns a grave just as it owns a house. A man dies and leaves his house to his son, and at the same time this dead father succeeds to his own father's grave. He moves out of the house and into the grave, and his predecessor moves out of the grave and into the cellar of the chapel. I saw a black box lying in the churchyard, with skull and crossbones painted on it, and was told that this was used in transferring remains to the cellar. In that cellar the bones and skulls of several hundred of former citizens were compactly corded up. They made a pile 18 feet long, 7 feet high, and 8 feet wide. I was told that in some of the receptacles of this kind in the Swiss villages the skulls were all marked, and if a man wished to find the skulls of his ancestors for several generations back, he could do it by these marks, preserved in the family records. An English gentleman who had lived some years in this region said it was the cradle of compulsory education, but he said that the English idea that compulsory education would reduce bastardy and intemperance was an error. It has not that effect. He said there was more seduction in the Protestant than in the Catholic cantons, because the confessional protected the girls. I wonder why it doesn't protect married women in France and Spain. This gentleman said that among the poorer peasants in the Valais it was common for the brothers in a family to cast lots to determine which of them should have the coveted privilege of marrying, and his brethren, doomed bachelors, heroically banded themselves together to help support the new family. We left Zermatt in a wagon, and in a rainstorm, too, for St. Nicholas about 10 o'clock one morning. Again we passed between those grass-clad, prodigious cliffs, specked with wee dwellings peeping over at us from velvety green walls 10 and 1,200 feet high. It did not seem possible that the imaginary chamois even could climb those precipices. Lovers on opposite cliffs probably kiss through a spyglass and correspond with a rifle. In Switzerland the farmer's plough is a wide shovel, which scrapes up and turns over the thin earthy skin of his native rock, and there the man of the plough is a hero. Now here, by our St. Nicholas road, was a grave, and it had a tragic story. A ploughman was skinning his farm one morning, not the steepest part of it, but still a steep part, that is, he was not skinning the front of his farm, but the roof of it, near the eaves, when he absent-mindedly let go of the plough handles to moisten his hands in the usual way. He lost his balance and fell out of his farm backward. Poor fellow, he never touched anything till he struck bottom 1,500 feet below. Note number 1. This was on a Sunday. M.T. End of note number 1. We throw a halo of heroism around the life of the soldier and the sailor because of the deadly dangers they are facing all the time, but we are not used to looking upon farming as a heroic occupation. This is because we have not lived in Switzerland. From St. Nicholas we struck out for Visp, or Wispach, on foot. The rainstorms had been at work during several days, and had done a deal of damage in Switzerland and Savoy. We came to one place where a stream had changed its course and plunged down a mountain in a new place, sweeping everything before it. Two poor but precious farms by the roadside were ruined. One was washed clear away, and the bedrock exposed. The other was buried out of sight under a tumbled chaos of rocks, gravel, mud, and rubbish. The resistless might of water was well exemplified. Some saplings which had stood in the way were bent to the ground, stripped clean of their bark, and buried under rocky debris. The road had been swept away, too. In another place, where the road was high up on the mountain's face, and its outside edge protected by flimsy masonry, we frequently came across spots where this masonry had carved off and left dangerous gaps for mules to get over, and with still more frequency we found the masonry slightly crumbled, and marked by mule hoofs, thus showing that there had been danger of an accident to somebody. When at last we came to a badly ruptured bit of masonry, with hoof-prints evidencing a desperate struggle to regain the lost foothold, I looked quite hopefully over the dizzy precipice, but there was nobody down there. They take exceedingly good care of their rivers in Switzerland and other portions of Europe. They wall up both banks with slanting solid stone masonry, so that from end to end of these rivers the banks look like the wharves at St. Louis and other towns on the Mississippi River. It was during this walk from St. Nicholas, in the shadow of the majestic Alps, that we came across some little children amusing themselves in what seemed at first a most odd and original way, but it wasn't. It was in simply a natural and characteristic way. They were roped together with a string, they had mimic alpenstocks and ice-axes, and were climbing a meek and lowly manure-pile with a most blood-curdling amount of care and caution. The guide at the head of the line cut imaginary steps in a laborious and painstaking way, and not a monkey budged till the step above was vacated. If we had waited, we should have witnessed an imaginary accident, no doubt, and we should have heard the intrepid band hurrah when they made the summit, and looked around upon the magnificent view, and seen them throw themselves down in exhausted attitudes for a rest in that commanding situation. In Nevada I used to see the children play at silver mining. Of course, the great thing was an accident in a mine, and there were two star parts, that of the man who fell down the mimic shaft, and that of the daring hero who was lowered into the depths to bring him up. I knew one small chap who always insisted on playing both of these parts, and he carried his point. He would tumble into the shaft and die, and then come to the surface and go back after his own remains. It is the smartest boy that gets the hero part everywhere. He is head guide in Switzerland, head miner in Nevada, head bullfighter in Spain, etc. But I knew a preacher's son, 7 years old, who once selected a part for himself compared to which those just mentioned are tame and unimpressive. Jimmy's father stopped him from driving imaginary horse-cars one Sunday, stopped him from playing captain of an imaginary steamboat next Sunday, stopped him from leading an imaginary army to battle the following Sunday, and so on. Finally the little fellow said, "I've tried everything, and they won't any of them do. What can I play?" "I hardly know, Jimmy, but you must play only things that are suitable to the Sabbath day." Next Sunday the preacher stepped softly to a back-room door to see if the children were rightly employed. He peeped in. A chair occupied the middle of the room, and on the back of it hung Jimmy's cap. One of his little sisters took the cap down, nibbled at it, then passed it to another small sister, and said, "Eat of this fruit, for it is good." The Reverend took in the situation. Alas, they were playing the expulsion from Eden. Yet he found one little crumb of comfort. He said to himself, "For once Jimmy has yielded the chief role. I have been wronging him. I did not believe there was so much modesty in him. I should have expected him to be either Adam or Eve." This crumb of comfort lasted but a very little while. He glanced around and discovered Jimmy standing in an imposing attitude in a corner, with a dark and deadly frown on his face. What that meant was very plain. He was impersonating the Deity. Think of the guileless sublimity of that idea. We reached Wiesbach at 8 p.m., only about 7 hours out from St. Nicholas, so we must have made fully a mile and a half an hour, and it was all downhill, too, and very muddy at that. We stayed all night at the Hôtel de Soleil. I remember it because the landlady, the portier, the waitress, and the chambermaid were not separate persons, but were all contained in one neat and chipper suit of spotless muslin, and she was the prettiest young creature I saw in all that region. She was the landlord's daughter, and I remember that the only native match to her I saw in all Europe was the young daughter of the landlord of a village inn in the Black Forest. Why don't more people in Europe marry and keep hotel? Next morning we left with a family of English friends and went by train to Brevet, and thence by boat across the lake to Ouchy, Lausanne. Ouchy is memorable to me, not on account of its beautiful situation and lovely surroundings, although these would make it stick long in one's memory, but as the place where I caught the London Times dropping into humor. It was not aware of it, though. It did not do it on purpose. An English friend called my attention to this lapse, and cut out the reprehensible paragraph for me. Think of encountering a grin like this on the face of that grim journal. Erratum. We are requested by Reuters Telegram Company to correct an erroneous announcement made in their Brisbane telegram of the 2nd inst., published in our impression of the 5th inst., stating that, quote, Lady Kennedy had given birth to twins, the eldest being a son, unquote. The company explain that the message they received contained the words, quote, Governor of Queensland, twins' first son, unquote. Being, however, subsequently informed that Sir Arthur Kennedy was unmarried and that there must be some mistake, a telegraphic repetition was at once demanded. It has been received today, 11th inst., and shows that the words really telegraphed by Reuters' agent were, quote, Governor Queensland turns first sod, unquote, alluding to the Maryborough-Gympie Railway in course of construction. The words in italics were mutilated by the telegraph in transmission from Australia, and reaching the company in the form mentioned above gave rise to the mistake. I had always had a deep and reverent compassion for the sufferings of the prisoner of Chillon, whose story Byron had told in such moving verse. So I took the steamer and made pilgrimage to the dungeons of the castle of Chillon, to see the place where poor Bonnivard endured his dreary captivity 300 years ago. I'm glad I did that, for it took away some of the pain I was feeling on the prisoner's account. His dungeon was a nice, cool, roomy place, and I cannot see why he should have been dissatisfied with it. If he had been imprisoned in a St. Nicholas private dwelling, where the fertilizer prevails, and the goat sleeps with the guest, and the chickens roost on him, and the cow comes in and bothers him when he wants to muse, it would have been another matter altogether. But he surely could not have had a very cheerless time of it in that pretty dungeon. It has romantic window-slits that let in generous bars of light, and it has tall, noble columns, carved apparently from the living rock, and what is more, they are written all over with thousands of names, some of them, like Byron's and Victor Hugo's, of the first celebrity. Why didn't he amuse himself reading these names? Then there are the couriers and tourists, swarms of them every day. What was to hinder him from having a good time with them? I think Bonnivard's sufferings have been overrated. Next we took the train and went to Martigny on the way to Mont Blanc. Next morning we started about 8 o'clock on foot. We had plenty of company, in the way of wagon-loads and mule-loads of tourists and dust. This scattering procession of travelers was perhaps a mile long. The road was uphill, interminable uphill, and tolerably steep. The weather was blisteringly hot, and the man or woman who had to sit on a creeping mule or in a crawling wagon and broil in the beating sun was an object to be pitied. We could dodge among the bushes and have the relief of shade, but those people could not. They paid for a conveyance, and to get their money's worth they rode. We went by the way of the Tête Noire, and after we reached high ground there was no lack of fine scenery. In one place the road was tunneled through a shoulder of the mountain. From there one looked down into a gorge with a rushing torrent in it, and on every hand was a charming view of rocky buttresses and wooded heights. There was a liberal allowance of pretty waterfalls, too, on the Tête Noire route. About half an hour before we reached the village of Argentière, a vast dome of snow, with the sun blazing on it, drifted into view and framed itself in a strong V-shaped gateway of the mountains, and we recognized Mont Blanc, the monarch of the Alps. With every step after that this stately dome rose higher and higher into the blue sky, and at last seemed to occupy the zenith. Some of Mont Blanc's neighbors, bare, light brown, steeple-like rocks, were very peculiarly shaped. Some were whittled to a sharp point, and slightly bent at the upper end, like a lady's finger. One monster sugar-loaf resembled a bishop's hat. It was too steep to hold snow on its sides, but had some in the division. While we were still on very high ground, and before the descent toward Argentière began, we looked up toward a neighboring mountain-top, and saw exquisite prismatic colors playing about some white clouds which were so delicate as to almost resemble gossamer webs. The faint pinks and greens were peculiarly beautiful. None of the colors were deep, they were the lightest shades. They were bewitching commingled. We sat down to study and enjoy this singular spectacle. The tints remained during several minutes, flitting, changing, melting into each other, paling almost away for a moment, then reflushing, a shifting, restless, unstable succession of soft opaline gleams, shimmering over that air-film of white cloud, and turning it into a fabric dainty enough to clothe an angel with. By and by we perceived what those super-delicate colors, and their continuous play and movement, reminded us of. It is what one sees in a soap-bubble that is drifting along, catching changes of tint from the objects it passes. A soap-bubble is the most beautiful thing and the most exquisite in nature. That lovely phantom fabric in the sky was suggestive of a soap-bubble split open and spread out in the sun. I wonder how much it would take to buy a soap-bubble if there was only one in the world. One could buy a hatful of Koh-i-Noors with the same money, no doubt. We made the tramp from Martigny to Argentière in 8 hours. We beat all the mules and wagons. We didn't usually do that. We hired a sort of open baggage wagon for the trip down the valley to Chamonix, and then devoted an hour to dining. This gave the driver time to get drunk. He had a friend with him, and this friend also had time to get drunk. When we drove off, the driver said all the tourists had arrived and gone by while we were at dinner. "But," said he, impressively, "be not disturbed by that. Remain tranquil. Give yourselves no uneasiness. Their dust rises far before us. Rest you tranquil. Leave all to me. I am king of drivers. Behold!" Down came his whip, and away we clattered. I never had such a shaking up in my life. The recent flooding rains had washed the road clear away in places, but we never stopped. We never slowed down for anything. We tore right along over rocks, rubbish, gullies, open fields, sometimes with 1 or 2 wheels on the ground, but generally with none. Every now and then that calm, good-natured madman would bend a majestic look over his shoulder at us and say, "Ah, you perceive, it is as I have said. I am the king of drivers." Every time we just missed going to destruction, he would say, with tranquil happiness, "Enjoy it, gentlemen. It is very rare. It is very unusual. It is given to few to ride with the king of drivers. And observe, it is as I have said, I am he." He spoke in French, and punctuated with hiccups. His friend was French, too, but spoke in German, using the same system of punctuation, however. The friend called himself the Captain of Mont Blanc, and wanted us to make the ascent with him. He said he had more ascents than any other man, 47, and his brother had made 37. His brother was the best guide in the world, except himself, but he, yes, observe him well, he was the Captain of Mont Blanc. That title belonged to none other. The king was as good as his word. He overtook that long procession of tourists and went by it like a hurricane. The result was that we got choicer rooms at the hotel in Chamonix than we should have done if His Majesty had been a slower artist, or rather, if he hadn't most providentially got drunk before he left Argentière. End of chapter 42. This is chapter 43 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, chapter 43, My Poor Sick Friend Disappointed. Everybody was out of doors. Everybody was in the principal street of the village, not on the sidewalks, but all over the street. Everybody was lounging, loafing, chatting, waiting, alert, expectant, interested, for it was train time. That is to say, it was diligence time. The half-dozen big diligences would soon be arriving from Geneva, and the village was interested in many ways in knowing how many people were coming and what sort of folk they might be. It was altogether the livest-looking street we had seen in any village on the continent. The hotel was by the side of a booming torrent, whose music was loud and strong. We could not see this torrent, for it was dark now, but one could locate it without a light. There was a large enclosed yard in front of the hotel, and this was filled with groups of villagers waiting to see the diligences arrive, or to hire themselves to excursionists for the morrow. A telescope stood in the yard, with its huge barrel canted up toward the lustrous evening star. The long porch of the hotel was populous with tourists, who sat in shawls and wraps under the vast overshadowing bulk of Mont Blanc, and gossiped or meditated. Never did a mountain seem so close. Its big sides seemed at one's very elbow, and its majestic dome and the lofty cluster of slender minarets that were its neighbors seemed to be almost over one's head. It was night in the streets, and the lamps were sparkling everywhere. The broad bases and shoulders of the mountains were in a deep gloom, but their summits swam in a strange rich glow which was really daylight, and yet had a mellow something about it which was very different from the hard white glare of the kind of daylight I was used to. Its radiance was strong and clear, but at the same time it was singularly soft and spiritual and benignant. No, it was not our harsh, aggressive, realistic daylight. It seemed properer to an enchanted land, or to heaven. I had seen moonlight and daylight together before, but I had not seen daylight and black night elbow to elbow before. At least I had not seen the daylight resting upon an object sufficiently close at hand before to make the contrast startling and at war with nature. The daylight passed away. Presently the moon rose up behind some of those sky-piercing fingers or pinnacles of bare rock of which I have spoken. They were a little to the left of the crest of Mont Blanc, and right over our heads. But she couldn't manage to climb high enough toward heaven to get entirely above them. She would show the glittering arch of her upper third occasionally, and scrape it along behind the comb-like row. Sometimes a pinnacle stood straight up, like a statuette of ebony, against that glittering white shield, then seemed to glide out of it by its own volition and power, and become a dim spectre, while the next pinnacle glided into its place and blotted the spotless disk with the black exclamation point of its presence. The top of one pinnacle took the shapely, clean-cut form of a rabbit's head, in the inkiest silhouette, while it rested against the moon. The unillumined peaks and minarets hovering vague and phantom-like above us, while the others were painfully white and strong with snow and moonlight, made a peculiar effect. But when the moon, having passed the line of pinnacles, was hidden behind the stupendous white swell of Mont Blanc, the masterpiece of the evening was flung on the canvas. A rich greenish radiance sprang into the sky from behind the mountain, and in this some airy shreds and ribbons of vapor floated about, and being flushed with that strange tint, went waving to and fro like pale green flames. After a while, radiating bars, vast broadening fan-shaped shadows, grew up and stretched away to the zenith from behind the mountain. It was a spectacle to take one's breath, for the wonder of it and the sublimity. Indeed, those mighty bars of alternate light and shadow streaming up from behind that dark and prodigious form, and occupying the half of the dull and opaque heavens, was the most imposing and impressive marvel I had ever looked upon. There is no simile for it, for nothing is like it. If a child had asked me what it was, I should have said, "Humble yourself in this presence. It is the glory flowing from the hidden head of the Creator." One falls shorter of the truth than that, sometimes, in trying to explain mysteries to the little people. I could have found out the cause of this awe-compelling miracle by inquiring, for it is not infrequent at Mont Blanc, but I did not wish to know. We have not the reverent feelings for the rainbow that a savage has, because we know how it is made. We have lost as much as we gained by prying into the matter. We took a walk down street, a block or two, and a place where 4 streets met and the principal shops were clustered, found the groups of men in the roadway thicker than ever, for this was the exchange of Chamonix. These men were in the costumes of guides and porters, and were there to be hired. The office of that great personage, the guide-in-chief of the Chamonix Guild of Guides, was nearby. This guild is a close corporation and is governed by strict laws. There are many excursion routes, some dangerous and some not, some that can be made safely without a guide and some that cannot. The Bureau determines these things. Where it decides that a guide is necessary, you are forbidden to go without one. Neither are you allowed to be a victim of extortion. The law states what you are to pay. The guides serve in rotation. You cannot select the man who is to take your life into his hands. You must take the worst in the lot, if it is his turn. A guide's fee ranges all the way up from $50, for some trifling excursions of a few rods, to $20, according to the distance traversed and the nature of the ground. A guide's fee for taking a person to the summit of Mont Blanc and back is $20, and he earns it. The time employed is usually 3 days, and there is enough early rising in it to make a man far more healthy and wealthy and wise than any one man has any right to be. The porter's fee for the same trip is $10. Several fools, no, I mean several tourists, usually go together and divide up the expense, and thus make it light. For if only one tourist, went, he would have to have several guides and porters, and that would make the matter costly. We went into the chief's office. There were maps of mountains on the walls, also 1 or 2 lithographs of celebrated guides, and a portrait of the scientist de Saussure. In glass cases were some labeled fragments of boots and batons, and other suggestive relics and remembrances of casualties on Mont Blanc. In a book was a record of all the ascents which have ever been made, beginning with numbers 1 and 2, being those of Jacques Balmat and de Saussure in 1787, and ending with number 685, which wasn't cold yet. In fact, number 685 was standing by the official table, waiting to receive the precious official diploma which should prove to his German household and to his descendants that he had once been indiscreet enough to climb to the top of Mont Blanc. He looked very happy when he got his document. In fact, he spoke up and said he was happy. I tried to buy a diploma for an invalid friend at home who had never traveled and whose desire all his life has been to ascend Mont Blanc, but the guide-in-chief rather insolently refused to sell me one. I was very much offended. I said I did not propose to be discriminated against on account of my nationality, that he had just sold a diploma to this German gentleman, and my money was as good as his. I would see to it that he couldn't keep his shop for Germans and deny his produce to Americans. I would have his license taken away from him at the dropping of a handkerchief. If France refused to break him, I would make an international matter of it and bring on a war. The soil should be drenched with blood, and not only that, but I would set up an opposition show and sell diplomas at half price. For 2 cents I would have done these things too, but nobody offered me 2 cents. I tried to move that German's feelings, but it could not be done. He would not give me his diploma, neither would he sell it to me. I told him my friend was sick and could not come himself, but he said he did not care a verdammtes Pfennig. He wanted his diploma for himself. Did I suppose he was going to risk his neck for that thing and then give it to a sick stranger? Indeed he wouldn't, so he wouldn't. I resolved then that I would do all I could to injure Mont Blanc. In the record book was a list of all the fatal accidents which happened on the mountain. It began with the one in 1820, when the Russian Dr. Hammel's 3 guides were lost in a crevice of the glacier, and it recorded the delivery of the remains in the valley by the slow-moving glacier 41 years later. The latest catastrophe bore the date 1877. We stepped out and roved about the village a while. In front of the little church was a monument to the memory of the bold guide Jacques Balmat, the first man who ever stood upon the summit of Mont Blanc. He made that wild trip solitary and alone. He accomplished the ascent a number of times afterward. A stretch of nearly half a century lay between his first ascent and his last one. At the ripe old age of 72, he was climbing around a corner of a lofty precipice of the Pic du Midi, nobody with him, when he slipped and fell. So he died in the harness. He had grown very avaricious in his old age, and used to go off stealthily to hunt for non-existent and impossible gold among those perilous peaks and precipices. He was on a quest of that kind when he lost his life. There was a statue to him, and another to de Saussure, in the hall of our hotel, and a metal plate on the door of a room upstairs bore an inscription to the effect that that room had been occupied by Albert Smith. Balmat and de Saussure discovered Mont Blanc, so to speak, but it was Smith who made it a paying property. His articles in Blackwood and his lectures on Mont Blanc in London advertised it and made people as anxious to see it as if it owed them money. As we strolled along the road, we looked up and saw a red signal light glowing in the darkness of the mountainside. It seemed but a trifling way up, perhaps 100 yards, a climb of 10 minutes. It was a lucky piece of sagacity in us that we concluded to stop a man whom we met and get a light for our pipes from him instead of continuing the climb to that lantern to get a light, as had been our purpose. The man said that that lantern was on the Grand Mulets, some 6,500 feet above the valley. I know by our Riffelberg experience that it would have taken us a good part of a week to go up there. I would sooner not smoke at all than take all that trouble for a light. Even in the daytime, the foreshadowing effect of this mountain's close proximity creates curious deceptions. For instance, one sees with the naked eye a cabin up there beside the glacier, and a little above and beyond he sees the spot where that red light was located. He thinks he could throw a stone from the one place to the other, but he couldn't, for the difference between the 2 altitudes is more than 3,000 feet. It looks impossible from below that this can be true, but it is true nevertheless. While strolling around, we kept the run of the moon all the time, and we still kept an eye on her after we got back to the hotel portico. I had a theory that the gravitation of refraction, being subsidiary to atmospheric compensation, the refrangibility of the earth's surface would emphasize this effect in regions where great mountain ranges occur, and possibly so even-handed impact the odic and idyllic forces together, the one upon the other, as to prevent the moon from rising higher than 12,200 feet above sea level. This daring theory had been received with frantic scorn by some of my fellow scientists, and with an eager silence by others. Among the former I may mention Professor H. Y., and among the latter Professor T. L. Such is professional jealousy. A scientist will never show any kindness for a theory which he did not start himself. There is no feeling of brotherhood among these people. Indeed, they always resent it when I call them brother. To show how far their ungenerosity can carry them, I will state that I offered to let Professor H. Y. publish my great theory as his own discovery. I even begged him to do it. I even proposed to print it myself as his theory. Instead of thanking me, he said that if I tried to fasten that theory on him he would sue me for slander. I was going to offer it to Mr. Darwin, whom I understood to be a man without prejudices, but it occurred to me that perhaps he would not be interested in it, since it did not concern heraldry. But I am glad now that I was forced to father my intrepid theory myself, for, on the night of which I am writing, it was triumphantly justified and established. Mont Blanc is nearly 16,000 feet high. He hid the moon utterly. Near him is a peak which is 12,216 feet high. The moon slid along behind the pinnacles, and when she approached that one I watched her with intense interest, for my reputation as a scientist must stand or fall by its decision. I cannot describe the emotions which surged like tidal waves through my breast when I saw the moon glide behind that lofty needle and pass it by without exposing more than 2 feet 4 inches of her upper rim above it. I was secure then. I knew she would rise no higher, and I was right. She sailed behind all the peaks and never succeeded in hoisting her disk above a single one of them. While the moon was behind one of those sharp fingers, its shadow was flung athwart the vacant heavens, a long, slanting, clean-cut, dark ray, with a streaming and energetic suggestion of force about it, such as the ascending jet of water from a powerful fire-engine affords. It was curious to see a good strong shadow of an earthly object cast upon so intangible a field as the atmosphere. We went to bed at last and went quickly to sleep, but I woke up, after about 3 hours, with throbbing temples and a head which was physically sore outside and in. I was dazed, dreamy, wretched, seedy, unrefreshed. I recognized the occasion of all this. It was that torrent. In the mountain villages of Switzerland and along the roads one has always the roar of the torrent in his ears. He imagines it is music, and he thinks poetic things about it. He lies in his comfortable bed and is lulled to sleep by it. But by and by he begins to notice that his head is very sore. He cannot account for it. In solitudes where the profoundest silence reigns, he notices a sullen, distant, continuous roar in his ears, which is like what he would experience if he had sea-shells pressed against them. He cannot account for it. He is drowsy and absent-minded. There is no tenacity to his mind. He cannot keep hold of a thought and follow it out. If he sits down to write, his vocabulary is empty. No suitable words will come. He forgets what he started to do, and remains there, pen in hand, head tilted up, eyes closed, listening painfully to the muffled roar of a distant train in his ears. In his soundest sleep the strain continues. He goes on listening, always listening intently, anxiously, and wakes at last harassed, irritable, unrefreshed. He cannot manage to account for these things. Day after day he feels as if he had spent his nights in a sleeping-car. It actually takes him weeks to find out that it is those persecuting torrents that have been making all the mischief. It is time for him to get out of Switzerland, then, for as soon as he has discovered the cause, the misery is magnified several-fold. The roar of the torrent is maddening, then, for his imagination is assisting. The physical pain it inflicts is exquisite. When he finds he is approaching one of those streams, his dread is so lively that he is disposed to fly the track and avoid the implacable foe. 8 or 9 months after the distress of the torrents had departed from me, the roar and thunder of the streets of Paris brought it all back again. I moved to the 6th story of the hotel to hunt for peace. About midnight the noises dulled away, and I was sinking to sleep, when I heard a new and curious sound. I listened. Evidently some joyous lunatic was softly dancing a double shuffle in the room over my head. I had to wait for him to get through, of course. 5 long, long minutes he smoothly shuffled away. A pause followed, then something fell with a thump on the floor. I said to myself, "There, he is pulling off his boots. Thank heavens he is done." Another slight pause. He went to shuffling again. I said to myself, "Is he trying to see what he can do with only one boot on?" Presently came another pause and another thump on the floor. I said, "Good, he has pulled off his other boot. Now he is done." But he wasn't. The next moment he was shuffling again. I said, "Confound him, he is at it in his slippers." After a little came that same old pause, and right after it that thump on the floor once more. I said, "Hang him, he had on 2 pairs of boots." For an hour that magician went on shuffling and pulling off boots till he had shed as many as 25 pair, and I was hovering on the verge of lunacy. I got my gun and stole up there. The fellow was in the midst of an acre of sprawling boots, and he had a boot in his hand, shuffling it. No, I mean polishing it. The mystery was explained. He hadn't been dancing. He was the boots of the hotel, and was attending to business. End of chapter 43. This is chapter 44 of A Tramp Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Tramp Abroad by Mark Twain, chapter 44, I Scale Mont Blanc, by Telescope. After breakfast, that next morning in Chamonix, we went out in the yard and watched the gangs of excursioning tourists arriving and departing with their mules and guides and porters. Then we took a look through the telescope at the snowy hump of Mont Blanc. It was brilliant with sunshine, and the vast smooth bulge seemed hardly 500 yards away. With the naked eye we could dimly make out the house at the Pierre Pointue, which is located by the side of the great glacier, and is more than 3,000 feet above the level of the valley. But with the telescope we could see all its details. While I looked, a woman rode by the house on a mule, and I saw her with sharp distinctness. I could have described her dress. I saw her nod to the people of the house, and rein up her mule, and put her hand up to shield her eyes from the sun. I was not used to telescopes. In fact, I had never looked through a good one before. It seemed incredible to me that this woman could be so far away. I was satisfied that I could see all these details with my naked eye. But when I tried it, that mule and those vivid people had wholly vanished, and the house itself was become small and vague. I tried the telescope again, and again everything was vivid. The strong black shadows of the mule and the woman were flung against the side of the house, and I saw the mule's silhouette wave its ears. The telescopulist, or the telescopulariat, I do not know which is right, said a party were making a grand ascent, and would come in sight on the remote upper heights presently. So we waited to observe this performance. Presently I had a superb idea. I wanted to stand with the party on the summit of Mont Blanc, merely to be able to say I had done it, and I believed the telescope could set me within 7 feet of the uppermost man. The telescoper assured me that it could. I then asked him how much I owed him for as far as I had got. He said 1 franc. I asked him how much it would cost to make the entire ascent. 3 francs. I at once determined to make the entire ascent, but first I inquired if there was any danger. He said no, not by telescope, said he had taken a great many parties to the summit, and never lost a man. I asked what he would charge to let my agent go with me, together with such guides and porters as might be necessary. He said he would let Harris go for 2 francs, and that unless we were unusually timid, he should consider guides and porters unnecessary. It was not customary to take them when going by telescope, for they were rather an encumbrance than a help. He said that the party now on the mountain were approaching the most difficult part, and if we hurried we should overtake them within 10 minutes, and could then join them and have the benefit of their guides and porters without their knowledge and without expense to us. I then said we would start immediately. I believe I said it calmly, though I was conscious of a shudder and of a paling cheek, in view of the nature of the exploit I was so unreflectingly engaged in. But the old daredevil spirit was upon me, and I said that as I had committed myself I would not back down. I would ascend Mont Blanc if it cost me my life. I told the man to slant his machine in the proper direction and let us be off. Harris was afraid and did not want to go, but I heartened him up and said I would hold his hand all the way. So he gave his consent, though he trembled a little at first. I took a last pathetic look upon the pleasant summer scene about me, then boldly put my eye to the glass and prepared to mount among the grim glaciers and the everlasting snows. We took our way carefully and cautiously across the great Glacier des Bossons, over yawning and terrific crevices, and among imposing crags and buttresses of ice, which were fringed with icicles of gigantic proportions. The desert of ice that stretched far and wide about us was wild and desolate beyond description, and the perils which beset us were so great that at times I was minded to turn back, but I pulled my pluck together and pushed on. We passed the glacier safely and began to mount the steeps beyond with great alacrity. When we were 7 minutes out from the starting point, we reached an altitude where the scene took a new aspect. An apparently limitless continent of gleaming snow was tilted heavenward before our faces. As my eye followed that awful acclivity far away up into the remote skies, it seemed to me that all I had ever seen before of sublimity and magnitude was small and insignificant compared to this. We rested a moment, and then began to mount with speed. Within 3 minutes we caught sight of the party ahead of us and stopped to observe them. They were toiling up a long, slanting ridge of snow, 12 persons, roped together some 15 feet apart, marching in single file and strongly marked against the clear blue sky. One was a woman. We could see them lift their feet and put them down. We saw them swing their alpenstocks forward in unison, like so many pendulums, and then bear their weight upon them. We saw the lady wave her handkerchief. They dragged themselves upward in a worn and weary way, for they had been climbing steadily from the Grand Mulette on the Glacier des Bossons since 3 in the morning, and it was 11 now. We saw them sink down in the snow and rest, and drink something from a bottle. After a while they moved on, and as they approached the final short dash of the home stretch, we closed up on them and joined them. Presently we all stood together on the summit. What a view was spread out below! Away off under the northwestern horizon rolled the silent billows of the Farnese Oberland, their snowy crests glinting softly in the subdued lights of distance. In the north rose the giant form of the Wobblehorn, draped from peak to shoulder in sable thunderclouds. Beyond him, to the right, stretched the grand processional summits of the Cisalpine Cordillera, drowned in a sensuous haze. To the east loomed the colossal masses of the Jodelhorn, the Fudelhorn, and the Dinnerhorn, their cloudless summits flashing white and cold in the sun. Beyond them shimmered the faint far line of the Goths of Jubelpore and the Aiguilles des Alleghanies. In the south towered the smoking peak of Popocatépetl and the unapproachable altitudes of the peerless Scrabblehorn. In the west-south the stately range of the Himalayas lay dreaming in a purple gloom. And thence, all around the curving horizon, the eye roved over a troubled sea of sun-kissed Alps, and noted here and there the noble proportions and the soaring domes of the Bottlehorn, and the Saddlehorn, and the Shovelhorn, and the Powderhorn, all bathed in the glory of noon, and mottled with softly gliding blots, the shadows flung from drifting clouds. Overcome by the scene, we all raised a triumphant, tremendous shout in unison. A startled man at my elbow said, "Confound you! What do you yell like that for, right in the street?" That brought me down to Chamonix like a flirt. I gave that man some spiritual advice, and disposed of him, and then paid the telescope man his full fee, and said that we were charmed with the trip and would remain down, and not reascend and require him to fetch us down by telescope. This pleased him very much, for of course we could have stepped back to the summit and put him to the trouble of bringing us home if we wanted to. I judged we could get diplomas now, anyhow, so we went after them, but the chief guide put us off with one pretext or another during all the time we stayed in Chamonix, and we ended up by never getting them at all. So much for his prejudice against people's nationality. However, we worried him enough to make him remember us and our ascent for some time. He even said once that he wished there was a lunatic asylum in Chamonix. This shows that he really had fears that we were going to drive him mad. It was what we intended to do, but lack of time defeated it. I cannot venture to advise the reader one way or the other as to ascending Mont Blanc. I say only this: if he is at all timid, the enjoyments of the trip will hardly make up for the hardships and sufferings he will have to endure. But if he has good nerve, youth, health, and a bold, firm will, and could leave his family comfortably provided for in case the worst happened, he would find the ascent a wonderful experience, and the view from the top a vision to dream about, and tell about, and recall with exultation all the days of his life. While I do not advise such a person to attempt the ascent, I do not advise him against it. But if he elects to attempt it, let him be warily careful of two things: choose a calm, clear day, and do not pay the telescope man in advance. There are dark stories about his getting advance payers on the summit and then leaving them there to rot. A frightful tragedy was once witnessed through the Chamonix telescopes. Think of questions and answers like these on an inquest. Coroner: "You saw deceased lose his life?" Witness: "I did." C. Where was he at the time? W. Close to the summit of Mont Blanc. C. Where were you? W. In the main street of Chamonix. C. What was the distance between you? W. A little over 5 miles, as the bird flies. This accident occurred in 1866, a year and a month after the disaster on the Matterhorn. 3 adventurous Englishmen, see Note 1, Sir George Young and his brothers James and Albert, end of Note 1, of great experience in mountain climbing, made up their minds to ascend Mont Blanc without guides or porters. All endeavors to dissuade them from their project failed. Powerful telescopes are numerous in Chamonix. These huge brass tubes, mounted on their scaffoldings and pointed skyward from every choice vantage ground, have the formidable look of artillery, and give the town the general aspect of getting ready to repel a charge of angels. The reader may easily believe that the telescopes had plenty of custom on that August morning in 1866, for everybody knew of the dangerous undertaking which was on foot, and all had fears that misfortune would result. All the morning the tubes remained directed toward the mountain heights, each with its anxious group around it, but the white deserts were vacant. At last, toward 11 o'clock, the people who were looking through the telescopes cried out, "There they are!" And sure enough, far up on the loftiest terraces of the Grand Plateau, the 3 pygmies appeared, climbing with remarkable vigor and spirit. They disappeared in the corridor and were lost to sight during an hour. Then they reappeared, and were presently seen standing together upon the extreme summit of Mont Blanc. So all was well. They remained a few minutes on that highest point of land in Europe, a target for all the telescopes, and were then seen to begin descent. Suddenly all 3 vanished. An instant after they appeared again, 2,000 feet below. Evidently they had tripped and been shot down an almost perpendicular slope of ice to a point where it joined the border of the upper glacier. Naturally, the distant witness supposed they were now looking upon 3 corpses, so they could hardly believe their eyes when they presently saw 2 of the men rise to their feet and bend over the 3rd. During 2 hours and a half they watched the 2 busying themselves over the extended form of their brother, who seemed entirely inert. Chamonix's affairs stood still. Everybody was in the street. All interest was centered upon what was going on upon that lofty and isolated stage 5 miles away. Finally the 2, one of them walking with great difficulty, were seen to begin descent, abandoning the 3rd, who was no doubt lifeless. Their movements were followed step by step until they reached the corridor and disappeared behind its ridge. Before they had had time to traverse the corridor and reappear, twilight was come, and the power of the telescope was at an end. The survivors had a most perilous journey before them in the gathering darkness, for they must get down to the Grand Mulets before they would find a safe stopping-place, a long and tedious descent, and perilous enough even in good daylight. The oldest guides expressed the opinion that they could not succeed, that all the chances were that they would lose their lives. Yet those brave men did succeed. They reached the Grand Mulets in safety. Even the fearful shock which their nerves had sustained was not sufficient to overcome their coolness and courage. It would appear from the official account that they were threading their way down through those dangers from the closing in of twilight until 2 o'clock in the morning or later, because the rescuing party from Chamonix reached the Grand Mulets about 3 in the morning, and moved thence toward the scene of the disaster under the leadership of Sir George Young, who had only just arrived. After having been on his feet 24 hours in the exhausting work of mountain climbing, Sir George began the reascent at the head of the relief party of 6 guides, to recover the corpse of his brother. This was considered a new imprudence, as the number was too few for the service required. Another relief party presently arrived at the cabin on the Grand Mulets and quartered themselves there to await events. 10 hours after Sir George's departure toward the summit, this new relief were still scanning the snowy altitudes above them from their own high perch among the ice deserts 10,000 feet above the level of the sea, but the whole forenoon had passed without a glimpse of any living thing appearing up there. This was alarming. Half a dozen of their number set out, then early in the afternoon, to seek and succor Sir George and his guides. The persons remaining at the cabin saw these disappear, and then ensued another distressing wait. 4 hours passed without tidings. Then at 5 o'clock another relief, consisting of 3 guides, set forward from the cabin. They carried food and cordials for the refreshment of their predecessors. They took lanterns with them, too. Night was coming on, and to make matters worse, a fine cold rain had begun to fall. At the same hour that these 3 began their dangerous ascent, the official guide-in-chief of the Mont Blanc region undertook the dangerous descent to Chamonix all alone to get reinforcements. However, a couple of hours later, at 7 p.m., the anxious solicitude came to an end, and happily. A bugle note was heard, and a cluster of black specks was distinguishable against the snows of the upper heights. The watchers counted these specks eagerly. 14. Nobody was missing. An hour and a half later they were all safe under the roof of the cabin. They had brought the corpse with them. Sir George Young tarried there but a few minutes, and then began the long and troublesome descent from the cabin to Chamonix. He probably reached there about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, after having been afoot among the rocks and glaciers during 2 days and 2 nights. His endurance was equal to his daring. The cause of the unaccountable delay of Sir George and the relief parties among the heights where the disaster had happened was a thick fog, or partly that and partly the slow and difficult work of conveying the dead body down the perilous steeps. The corpse, upon being viewed at the inquest, showed no bruises, and it was some time before the surgeons discovered that the neck was broken. One of the surviving brothers had sustained some unimportant injuries, but the other had suffered no hurt at all. How these men could fall 2,000 feet almost perpendicularly and live afterward is a most strange and unaccountable thing. A great many women have made the ascent of Mont Blanc. An English girl, Miss Stratton, conceived the daring idea 2 or 3 years ago of attempting the ascent in the middle of winter. She tried it, and she succeeded. Moreover, she froze 2 of her fingers on the way up. She fell in love with her guide on the summit, and she married him when she got to the bottom again. There is nothing in romance, in a way of a striking situation, which can beat this love scene in mid-heaven on an isolated ice crest with the thermometer at 0 and an Arctic gale blowing. The first woman who ascended Mont Blanc was a girl aged 22, Mademoiselle Maria Paradis, 1809. Nobody was with her but her sweetheart, but he was not a guide. The sex then took a rest for about 30 years, when a Mademoiselle d'Angeville made the ascent, 1838. In Chamonix I picked up a rude old lithograph of that day which pictured her in the act. However, I value it less as a work of art than as a fashion plate. Miss d'Angeville put on a pair of men's pantaloons to climb it, which was wise, but she cramped their utility by adding her petticoat, which was idiotic. One of the mournfulest calamities which men's disposition to climb dangerous mountains has resulted in happened on Mont Blanc in September 1870. M. Dare tells the story briefly in his Histoire du Mont Blanc. In the next chapter I will copy its chief features. End of chapter 44.